Hello everyone, I am the Creeps Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I don't remember exactly who first brought it up, but it had been a topic at school for a while. There was this old property a few miles out of town, abandoned, at least as far as anyone knew. Some kids said it used to be a ranch. Others thought it had been an old boarding school, or maybe a hunting lodge. The details didn't really matter. What mattered was that everyone said it was haunted. That was enough for me and my friends to want to see it for ourselves. There were 4 of us, me, James, Carter, and Riley. We were all bored, and it was one of those nights where it felt like the town was dead. Nothing was happening, no parties, no plans. So when Carter brought up the property again, it seemed like the perfect way to kill a few hours. We didn't plan on going inside, just driving up to get a look at it. That's all. A quick drive, maybe some photos for fun, and then back home. We weren't looking for trouble. From what we'd heard, the place sat on dozens of acres, out past the last stretch of farmland before the county line. There was no fence, no signs, no gates, just a dirt road leading up a hill where you could overlook the whole property. It seemed harmless enough. So we all piled into my car, an old Honda Civic that was way past its best years, and headed out toward the hills. The farther we drove, the fewer houses there were. Street lights disappeared. The pavement turned to gravel, and then to dirt. The road to the property was rough. Not the worst I'd ever driven on, but definitely the kind that made my suspension groan with every bump. Dust kicked up behind us in thick clouds, making it hard to see anything in the rearview mirror. We weren't talking much, just staring out the windows at the dark, open land. No houses, no lights, just the occasional silhouette of a fence post or a dead tree, blurred by the motion of the car. Finally, after about a mile, the road curved up a hill. It was steeper than I expected, and I had to push the gas harder than I liked. The engine whined as we climbed, the tires crunching over loose dirt and scattered rocks. At the top, the land leveled out. I slowed the car and pulled off to the side, parking in the dry grass just off the road. From there, we could see everything. The property stretched out below us, a mix of fields, patches of trees, and a few scattered buildings. The main structure was large, long and low, like an old ranch house, or maybe a barn that had been converted into living quarters. There were smaller buildings too, but from this distance, it was hard to tell what they were. Everything was dark. No porch lights. No movement. Just the faintest outline of rooftops against the night sky. We sat there for a moment, just looking. It felt weirdly quiet. Even the wind had died down. Something about it felt wrong. I didn't believe in ghosts. None of us did. But I remember feeling uneasy, like we were being watched. Then I saw it. A pair of headlights. Not from the main house. Not from any of the outbuildings. But from somewhere off in the trees, far to the side. At first, I thought maybe we'd just imagined it. The glow of the moon reflecting off something. A trick of the eyes. But then they flickered, disappeared for a second, then came back, like someone had just turned their ignition. I felt my stomach drop. The headlights started moving. Slowly at first, winding through the trees, bouncing over the rough terrain. They were coming toward us. A truck. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then caught. I threw the car into reverse, but I had to be careful. The road behind us was narrow, with a sharp drop on one side. If I backed up too fast, we'd be rolling down the hill. The truck kept coming. Then, just as it reached the bottom of the hill, its headlights cut off. Everything went black. For a second, none of us moved. We just sat there, frozen, staring into the darkness where the truck had been. And then suddenly, the lights flashed back on, asterisk, asterisk, right in front of us. Asterisk, asterisk. The truck had climbed the hill with its lights off, moving fast and quiet, closing the distance before we could react. It roared toward us, tires spinning, dirt flying. I slammed the gas and yanked the wheel. The tires skidded, struggling for traction on the dry ground. The car lurched forward just as the truck reached us. Its front bumper missed my back end by inches. We weren't dealing with some curious landowner coming to ask what we were doing. Whoever was in that truck had just tried to hit us. And they weren't done. I tore down the hill, barely keeping control. The dirt road twisted and dipped, and my headlights barely lit the way. Every time I turned, The truck stayed right behind us, matching every move. We hit the bottom of the hill, and I floored it. The truck did too. 60 miles an hour down a dirt road in the dark. My tires were slipping, catching, slipping again. Every time I hit a rut, the car jolted so hard I thought we'd flip. The truck was getting closer. I could see its headlights in my mirror, impossibly bright, bouncing with the motion of the chase. Then, bam, a sudden jolt. The whole car shook as the truck slammed into my back bumper. I almost lost control. My foot was glued to the gas. The only thing that mattered was getting off that property, back to a real road, somewhere with street lights and houses and people. But the truck kept coming. We hit pavement. The tires gripped better now, but the truck wasn't stopping. We flew through a stop sign, barely missing a parked car on the side of the road. The truck stayed right on us, swerving violently, trying to ram us again. We were in a neighborhood now. Houses blurred past, their windows dark. I wondered if anyone could hear us, if they'd wake up to the sound of an engine screaming down their street, tires screeching, dirt flying. Then up ahead I saw it. A church. I was going too fast to stop. The road curved sharply right before the entrance, and if I didn't turn in time, we'd go straight into the side of the building. I wrenched the wheel. The car fishtailed, barely making the turn. The truck didn't. At the last second, it slammed the brakes, tires skidding, the back end swinging out. It missed the church by feet. Then, just like that, it stopped. The engine idled for a second. Then the truck turned, pulling back onto the road. Without its headlights, it disappeared into the night. We didn't stop driving until we were back in town. No one spoke. No one laughed. We just sat there, shaking, trying to process what had happened. I know we were trespassing. I know we shouldn't have been there. But there were no signs, no warnings, no barriers. And yet, that guy had chased us miles beyond his property, trying to ram us off the road again and again. We could have died. That's what stuck with me the most. Not the chase, not the near misses, but the fact that whoever was behind the wheel of that truck had wanted to hurt us. And he had felt justified in doing it. And that's what scares me the most. People will do anything if they think they're in the right. I wasn't expecting much from the date, to be honest. I had met him on Tinder, and while he seemed nice enough in our messages, you never really know what you're walking into until you're sitting across from them in real life. To my surprise, we hit it off well. We met at a small bar close to my apartment. Neutral ground, easy exit if things got weird. But they didn't. He was funny, easy to talk to, and didn't give off any strange vibes. He had a way of making conversation flow naturally, and before I knew it, hours had passed. I wasn't ready to call it a night just yet. Since my place was nearby, I suggested heading there to keep talking. It felt like the kind of date where you don't want to force an ending just because of the time. He agreed, and we walked the short distance to my apartment, the air cool but not cold, the streets quiet but not eerie. Inside, I offered him a drink, and we sat in my living room, talking about everything and nothing. It felt relaxed, natural. I wasn't planning on anything happening beyond the night's conversation. I made that clear before we even left the bar, and he didn't push. Eventually, it got late, later than I had realized. I yawned and stretched, glancing at the clock. It was past 2 a.m. "You can crash here if you want," I said, motioning toward the pull-out couch in my living room. "It beats calling an Uber this late." He thanked me, and I grabbed some spare blankets from my closet. The pull-out wasn't the best, but it was comfortable enough for a night. He settled in while I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and headed upstairs to my bedroom. I changed into a t-shirt and shorts, slid under the covers, and exhaled, feeling the night's exhaustion catch up with me. The faint city sounds outside were familiar, the kind that blended into the background after years of living here. The apartment itself was quiet, and I started to drift off almost immediately. But then came the knocking. Not aggressive, but firm. A few quick raps against my bedroom door. I snapped awake, disoriented. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then came more knocking, followed by shuffling noises outside my door. I sat up, heart hammering. Then his voice came through, slightly muffled but clear enough. "I'm hungry." I blinked, still trying to shake off sleep. I checked my phone. Barely 15 minutes had passed since I got into bed. "I'm starving," he said again, his voice strange now, less casual. Annoyance replaced my initial confusion. I got out of bed, opened the door just enough to look at him. He stood in the dim hallway, shifting slightly, his posture uneasy. I sighed and walked downstairs, flicking on the kitchen light. He followed close behind, too close. My irritation grew, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just drunker than I thought. I pulled open the fridge. "Do you want some?" "No," he cut in. I frowned. I hadn't even finished the sentence. I tried again. "There's some." "No," he interrupted again. Every single thing I suggested, he refused, his responses short and immediate, like he wasn't actually thinking about them. His eyes darted toward the front door, then back at me. "I really think we should go out," he said suddenly. That's when I finally felt something other than just irritation. Something was off. I hesitated, gripping the fridge handle. His insistence, the way he had knocked so soon after I went to bed, the way he wouldn't accept any food, but still claimed to be starving, it all suddenly felt unnatural. "I just want to grab something from outside," he continued. "Come with me." I stared at him, trying to read his face. His expression was hard to place. Not aggressive, not exactly nervous, but something in between. I didn't want to go. I didn't feel like being out on the street this late, and something in my gut told me not to follow him. But I also didn't want to escalate things. He was inside my home. If I pushed back too hard, I didn't know how he'd react. So I grabbed my keys and threw on a hoodie, acting as if I was just going along with it to make things easier. We stepped outside, the night air cooler than before. The street was empty. Dim yellow streetlights cast long shadows. As soon as the door shut behind me, he exhaled sharply, shoulders dropping. "I saw someone," he said, voice lower now. I frowned. "What?" "In your living room, behind the curtain." A rush of cold spread through my chest. For a second, I thought he was joking, playing some weird game. But his face wasn't amused. "When I was trying to sleep," he said, "I saw movement. I thought maybe it was the light from outside, but then I saw the shape. Someone standing there, behind the curtain, barely moving." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "There was someone inside?" I asked. He nodded. "I didn't want to panic you, but I needed to get you out of the apartment." Every hair on my body stood on end. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it. Had I forgotten to lock the door? Had someone slipped in while we were talking? But we had been in that room the entire time. How could someone have gotten in? The curtain in my living room was heavy, long enough to pull slightly at the floor. If someone was behind it, hiding, waiting. I turned, scanning the apartment from the outside. The windows were dark, everything looking still. But that meant nothing. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and called the police. I told them I thought there was an intruder in my home. They asked if I was inside. I said no. They told me to stay put. Minutes dragged. The guy stood next to me, shifting his weight, glancing toward the apartment, but not speaking. The silence was thick, the kind that made your ears ring. Then the flashing blue and red lights washed over the street. The officers moved quickly. They went inside, guns drawn. We stayed back, waiting, listening. It felt like forever. Then one of them came back out, his face unreadable. "There was someone in there," he confirmed. A wave of nausea hit me. We found the back door unlocked. No signs of forced entry, so we don't know if he picked the lock or if it was left open. He looked at me. "Are you sure you locked up?" I nodded slowly, but doubt crept in. I had checked, hadn't I? They didn't catch him. Whoever he was gone by the time they cleared the apartment. The only trace of him was a set of muddy footprints near the curtain. I didn't sleep in that apartment that night. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I went through everything, trying to piece it together. Had he been there the entire time? Had he slipped in while we were talking? Or, worst of all, had he been there before we even came home? I never got an answer. But I never stayed in that apartment alone again. I was a missionary in Brazil when I met Bickford. I was young, naive, and still believed I had a responsibility to help anyone who showed interest in what we were preaching. That's what we were there for, to find people, teach them, and hope they'd accept our message. Bickford didn't fit the usual mold. He was an American, probably in his late 50s or 60s, though it was hard to tell. His long, unkempt beard and ragged clothing made him look like he had been living off the grid for years. He spoke English fluently, almost perfectly, which immediately made him stand out in the small town where we were stationed. Most Americans in Brazil were either expats with money or tourists passing through. He was neither. The first time we met him, he approached us on the street. grinning through his thick beard. His clothes were filthy, his hair tangled, and his eyes, they had a strange light to them, like he was amused by something we couldn't see. He greeted us in English, which took us by surprise. We were used to stumbling through Portuguese every day, so hearing someone speak to us in our native language was an immediate relief. Bickford claimed he had been living in Brazil for decades, though he was vague on the details. He asked for a copy of the Book of Mormon, but it was clear that what he really wanted was to talk. He seemed excited just to be speaking English with other Americans. He asked where we were from, how long we'd been in Brazil, what we thought of the country. It seemed harmless, just a lonely old man who wanted some company. We met with him a few more times. Never at his house, always on the side of the road or in some other secluded, yet public place. He would wave us down, as if by chance, and we'd end up sitting on a bench or leaning against a fence talking. He would listen to our lessons, nodding along, but something always felt off. He wasn't like the other people we taught. There was no real curiosity, no genuine questions. Just an odd energy, a quiet amusement, like he was playing a game we didn't understand. Then there were the lies. Small ones at first, things that didn't add up. He would tell us he had been a teacher, then later say he worked in construction his whole life. He once said he had never been married, then later mentioned an ex-wife in passing. He contradicted himself constantly, but always in a casual, offhand way that made it hard to call him out. Despite the growing sense of unease, we kept meeting with him. When we mentioned him in our weekly report to the local church leaders, the reaction was immediate. The bishop and his assistants knew exactly who we were talking about. Stay away from him, they warned. They didn't go into detail, just that he was unstable, that every year or so he would start bothering missionaries before disappearing again. They wouldn't say exactly what he had done in the past, only that we shouldn't waste our time on him. That should have been enough. It should have been the end of it. But we were young, and we thought we knew better. We had spoken with him multiple times, and he hadn't done anything threatening. He was strange, yes, but strange didn't mean dangerous. So we kept meeting with him. One night, he told us about his house. "It's beautiful out there," he said. "Peaceful. No one bothers me." He described it as a cabin deep in the jungle, far from the main roads. No electricity, no running water, just nature and silence. He invited us to visit, said he'd meet us at the road and guide us down the path himself. I remember hesitating. I think my companion did too, but we said yes. The night we were supposed to meet, we stood on the side of the road waiting. It was late, much later than we should have been out, but we didn't want to leave before he showed up. The road was empty, just a cracked strip of pavement cutting through thick jungle. The trees loomed on either side, their tops swaying in the humid air. He was late. We started thinking about leaving. But then, out of the darkness, he appeared. He led us off the road and into the jungle. The path was overgrown, barely visible in the dim light. I had a small LED flashlight, but it felt useless in the thick darkness. Every few steps, I walked into a spiderweb, the sticky strands clinging to my face. I hated spiders. The ones in Brazil were massive, nightmare creatures that moved too fast and hid too well. I wiped at my face, trying to stay calm, but the deeper we went, the more unsettled I felt. We walked for what felt like forever. The jungle was silent except for our footsteps and the occasional rustling in the undergrowth. Bickford walked ahead, moving easily through the thick foliage. He didn't talk much, just kept leading us forward. Then finally we saw it. A small clearing. A collapsed wooden structure that had once been a cabin. It wasn't what I expected. Not even close. The roof had caved in on one side. The wooden walls were weathered and rotting. There were no windows, no door, just a gaping hole where the entrance had been. Bickford stepped inside and gestured for us to follow. "Welcome home," he said. We stepped in. The inside was worse than the outside. There was no furniture, only broken pieces scattered across the floor. Someone had destroyed them, not just with time, but deliberately. Chairs were smashed beyond recognition. The walls were covered in grime. The air was thick with the smell of rot. And then I saw the notes. They were everywhere. Chalk scrawled on every inch of the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Tiny, frenzied writing. Dates. Phrases. Over and over. "Jesus will forgive me, but I have to stop." I did it again. And then names. Children's names. Ages. Detailed descriptions. I froze. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming to run. My companion and I exchanged a glance. I saw the fear in his eyes. He saw it in mine. We did not mention the notes. We did not react. Instead, we asked about the stove, the rotting food, the rats. Anything but the notes. Anything but what we had just read. We had to leave. Now, we made an excuse. Too late, we needed to go. He hesitated, then nodded. But as we stepped outside, he stopped. I know a shortcut, he said. He pointed not toward the road, but deeper into the jungle. I didn't hesitate. We'll just go back the way we came. He insisted. We refused. The air was thick with tension. Then, finally, he shrugged and let us go. We walked fast, retracing our steps through the jungle. This time, I didn't care about the spiderwebs. I didn't care about the darkness. I just needed to get back to the road. When we reached the pavement, we stopped and looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. That night, we called our leaders. A week later, we were moved to a different area. Before we left, we made sure to write his name in the area book. A warning: stay away from Bickford. The air smelled of damp earth and manure. The kind of smell that lingered in the back of the throat, thick and heavy, the way only farmland could smell in late summer. The road here was barely a road at all, just a strip of dirt and gravel cutting through fields that stretched out in every direction. The farm sat nestled in a low valley, surrounded by swaying grass and patches of trees, the nearest town miles away. I parked just outside the barn, pulling up next to the only building in sight besides the farmhouse itself. The sun sat high overhead, the sky open and cloudless, heat shimmering off the dirt road behind me. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. I got out and shut the door, the sound sharp in the stillness. The dog jumped out after me, his leash taut in my grip. He was restless, whining under his breath, ears flicking back and forth as if listening for something I couldn't hear. I glanced around. The farm looked empty. No truck in the driveway. No movement beyond the slow sway of the wind in the tall grass. It felt abandoned. I had only stopped here for a break. A quick stretch of the legs before continuing the long drive home. I didn't know this farm. Had never been here before. It was just a place along the road, one of many in the long stretch of nothingness between here and civilization. The dog yanked on the leash suddenly, nearly pulling me off balance. "Hey," I muttered, gripping the handle tighter. He let out a high-pitched whine, pulling harder, his whole body vibrating with nervous energy. Then he was gone. The leash snapped out of my grip, his collar slipping loose, and in an instant he was running. "Stop!" I yelled, but he didn't. He bolted around the side of the barn, kicking up dirt, his tail vanishing behind the wooden slats. I ran after him. The barn was massive, old wood towering above me as I rounded the corner, my breath already short from the sudden sprint. The dog was ahead, paws skidding against the dirt, scrambling towards something in the distance. Then I saw it, a massive, open pit in the ground. I didn't understand what it was at first. It was just a deep, rectangular hole, the edges lined with rusted metal, dark liquid sloshing inside. The smell hit me next, thick and overwhelming, burning my throat. It wasn't water. The surface was dark brown, almost black, moving sluggishly in thick ripples. The dog didn't stop. He hit the edge at full speed, his front paws scrambling for purchase. For a fraction of a second, he hung there, claws digging at the metal rim. Then he slipped. His body twisted as he tumbled forward, the splash sickeningly thick as he hit the surface and went under. I reached the edge a second too late. The dog surfaced, spluttering, paddling frantically. But the liquid wasn't like water. It clung to him, thick and heavy, dragging him down. He gasped, panicked, his eyes wild as he tried to stay afloat. I didn't think. I jumped. The impact was immediate. The liquid was thicker than I expected. It closed over my head instantly, swallowing me whole. The smell was unbearable, choking the air from my lungs before I could even breathe. I surfaced, gasping, gagging. The dog was just ahead, barely above the surface, his eyes rolling in panic. I kicked toward him, my arms barely moving in the thick sludge. Every stroke took double the effort, my legs fighting to stay above the surface. It was like swimming in wet cement. I reached him, grabbed him, held him against me. His paws flailed, pushing against my shoulders, scrambling for something to hold on to. He was shaking, his whole body slick and covered in the same thick filth that coated my skin. I turned, trying to find the edge. It was too high. I hadn't noticed before, but from down here, the walls stretched up above me, smooth and impossible to grip. There were no ladders, no ropes, no way out. Panic started creeping in. The smell made it hard to think. It burned my lungs, filled my nose, soaked into every inch of my skin. My arms were already aching, the weight of the thick sludge pulling me down, making every movement a battle. I tried to push the dog up, holding him against the edge, but he couldn't get a grip. His paws slid uselessly against the metal. He whimpered. I didn't know what to do. I tried yelling for help. My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me. My throat burned, my lungs straining against the toxic fumes. The dog slipped lower. His struggles slowed. No, I gasped, shifting my grip, trying to hold him up. He was too heavy. My arms were shaking. My breath was coming in shorter, shallower gasps. I tried to tread water, to keep us both up, but it was getting harder. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. The air was wrong. Every breath felt weaker, less real, like I was breathing something that wasn't air at all. My chest felt tight. My arms were going numb. I tried to move toward the wall again, tried to reach up, but my fingers barely scraped the edge. It was too high. My grip slipped. The dog went under. I screamed, plunging my hands into the filth, trying to grab him, trying to pull him back up. He didn't come back up. I reached down, my arms disappearing into the thick, suffocating liquid, my fingers grasping at nothing. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. My head spun. The fumes were pressing in, turning my thoughts sluggish, making everything slow. I tried to kick, to move, but my body wasn't responding. I was sinking. My chest convulsed. My head tilted back, my face barely above the surface. The sky blurred. The edges of my vision darkened. I couldn't breathe. The last thing I saw was the sun, blindingly bright, before everything went black. When the farmer returned home that evening, he noticed the car first. The doors were open. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver was nowhere to be seen. He checked the house, the barn, the fields. Then he found the pit. The smell hit him before he saw what was inside. 2 bodies floated in the dark filth. 1 human, 1 animal, both still, half submerged, the liquid rippling gently around them. There were no signs of struggle, no claw marks on the edge, no evidence of an attempt to escape, just silence and the smell of death. I never thought I'd end up living alone. I had always been the type to surround myself with people, friends, roommates, a partner. I liked the idea of independence in theory, but in reality, it terrified me. I had spent the last 3 years living with my ex in this house, and when the relationship ended, she moved out, leaving me with 3 bedrooms, a bathroom and a half, and too much silence. The house wasn't huge, but it felt massive when I was alone in it. It sat on a quiet street, just far enough from downtown that the nights were pitch black, with only the occasional streetlight breaking up the darkness. I had neighbors, but they weren't close, both physically and socially. The nearest house was across the street, and I barely knew the people who lived there beyond a few polite nods when taking out the trash. It had been about 2 months since my ex left, and I was still adjusting to being alone. I kept the TV on most nights just to fill the space with some kind of noise, even if I wasn't watching it. My dog, a small but loud mix of who knows what, had become my constant companion. She wasn't big enough to do much damage if someone actually broke in, but she had an ear-piercing bark, and she was territorial enough to make anyone reconsider stepping too close. That night started like any other. I had spent the evening scrolling on my phone, watching pointless videos, trying to ignore the nagging feeling of unease that always crept up when the house got too quiet. I double-checked that the doors were locked, even though I always locked them. It was a habit I had developed after moving in. I had never been the type to leave doors unlocked, but living alone had made me even more cautious. I went to bed sometime around midnight, my dog curled up at my feet. I left a small lamp on in the corner of my room, not bright enough to keep me awake, but enough to cut through the total darkness. The house settled around me, the usual creaks and groans of an old structure cooling in the night air. I was used to those sounds by now. What I wasn't used to was the sudden explosion of barking that jolted me awake. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up, disoriented. My dog had launched herself off the bed, her paws skidding on the hardwood as she bolted toward the window. She was losing her mind, barking louder than I'd ever heard her. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping on the glass. I froze. For a moment, I thought I was still half asleep, that maybe I had imagined it. But the tapping came again, louder this time. Then I heard the sound that sent ice through my veins, leaves crackling outside my window. Someone was standing just beyond the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My brain couldn't keep up with what was happening. The tapping continued, growing more insistent. It wasn't gentle, like a branch swaying in the wind. It was rhythmic, purposeful. Someone was out there. I forced myself to move, sliding out of bed as quietly as possible. My dog was still at the window, barking her head off. I had no idea what to do. I wanted to look, to see who was out there, but at the same time, I didn't. What if they were looking back? My phone screen lit up as I unlocked it, the brightness momentarily blinding me. My first instinct was to call someone, but I had no idea who. The police? A friend? My new girlfriend? I had only been seeing her for a few weeks, and it felt ridiculous to wake her up for this. The tapping suddenly stopped. The silence was worse. Then, from the other side of the house, I heard it. The sound of a doorknob turning. My stomach dropped. I had two entrances to the house, one in the front, facing the street, and one in the back, off the kitchen. Someone was at the back door. The knob rattled violently, followed by a heavy thud. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I bolted from my bedroom, phone clutched in my hand, heart hammering in my chest. The kitchen was dark, but I could see the back door. The knob was still jerking, the door shaking as someone slammed into it over and over. My dog was right behind me, barking so hard she was practically coughing. I hit the call button on my phone, not even thinking about who I had dialed. The ringing felt like it went on forever before I heard my girlfriend's groggy voice. I barely registered what she was saying. My own voice came out panicked, almost incoherent. My thoughts were racing so fast I couldn't even process my own words. The slamming on the door stopped. I turned my head, and my stomach flipped inside out. A face. There was a face in my kitchen window, staring right at me. The only light came from the small digital clock on the microwave, but it was enough. I could see the shape of a man, his forehead pressed against the glass, eyes scanning the room. We locked eyes. I felt like my entire body had been submerged in ice water. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It could have been seconds. It could have been an hour. The moment stretched, unbearable. Then he moved. He disappeared from the window, and a second later, the front door handle started rattling. I finally forced myself to do the one thing I should have done immediately. I called 911. My voice was shaking so badly, I could barely get the words out. The dispatcher asked for my address, my name, told me to stay inside. A patrol car was already in the area. I ran back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, pressing my back against it as though that would keep anything out. My dog was still going crazy, pacing in frantic circles. I held on to her, trying to keep myself from completely breaking down. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The house went silent. I stayed locked in my room for what felt like hours. I didn't hear sirens. I didn't hear voices. Just silence. Finally, after what I guessed was about 30 minutes, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered it anyway. It was the police. The officer told me they had found the man a few streets over. He was extremely drunk and had gotten confused. He thought my house was his. He had been banging on the door, furious that his wife had supposedly locked him out. That was it. That was the explanation. I sat there, numb, phone pressed to my ear. The officer reassured me that he was in custody, that there was no real threat. But my hands were still shaking. My heart was still hammering. Drunk or not, he had been outside my window. He had been trying to get inside. If I hadn't locked my doors, if he had made it in, what would have happened then? I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, sitting in bed with my dog curled up beside me. Every small sound made my skin crawl. The next day, I checked every lock in the house again. Then I checked them again. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom door before going to sleep. I still live alone. I still check the locks. And I still wake up some nights, heart pounding, convinced I hear tapping at my window. I had just finished a long shift at the bar. My feet ached, my head buzzed, and all I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. It had been one of those nights where the hours dragged. The tips were okay, but not great. and the customers were just drunk enough to be annoying, but not enough to tip well. I was exhausted. It was late, close to 2 a.m., and the roads were empty. This was Central California, mostly flat, dry farmland, with long stretches of road cutting through fields and orchards. At this hour, the only signs of life were the occasional headlights from some other late-night driver, a few gas stations glowing in the distance, and the dim glow of the radio clock on my dashboard. The gas gauge was low, hovering just above empty. I sighed, gripping the steering wheel, already debating whether I could make it home on what I had left, but I didn't want to risk it. The last thing I needed was to break down in the middle of nowhere. I spotted a small gas station up ahead. One of those independent ones, not part of any big chain, just a couple of pumps and a convenience store, its fluorescent lights buzzing against the dark sky. I pulled in, coasting up to Pump 4, and parked. There were a couple of other cars in the lot. One at a pump on the other side, another parked off to the side near the store. Neither seemed occupied, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, after all. Maybe they belonged to the guy working inside, or maybe someone was grabbing a snack before getting back on the road. I slid my card into the machine, punched in my zip code, and started fueling up. The gas station was quiet. No other cars pulled in, no one walked past. It was just the distant hum of the freeway, the occasional chirp of insects in the distance, and the steady clicking sound of my gas pump. I leaned against my car, crossing my arms, rubbing the sleeves of my hoodie. The night was cool, the kind of cold that settles in after a long, hot day. I exhaled, staring at the station's flickering neon sign, just zoning out, waiting for the tank to fill. Then the intercom crackled. "Ma'am at Pump 4, please see cashier." The voice was flat, a little muffled. I blinked, shaking off my tiredness. I didn't react at first, just stared at the convenience store window, the glow of the interior lights making it hard to see inside. Then the intercom crackled again. "Ma'am at Pump 4, please come inside. There's an issue with the payment." I frowned, glancing at the pump screen. No error message. The transaction was still processing, the numbers climbing as gas flowed into my tank. Weird. I sighed, pulling the nozzle out, hooking it back up. Maybe their system was just being slow. Maybe my card had gotten flagged for some reason. It happened sometimes, especially late at night. I locked my car out of habit, then walked toward the store. The glass doors slid open, and I stepped into the artificial brightness. The guy behind the counter was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a black hoodie and a baseball cap. His face was pale, his expression tight, like he was holding his breath. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, but before I could, he shook his head slightly, just a tiny movement, barely noticeable. Then he spoke, low and careful. "Stay calm. I already called 911. I froze. For a second, my brain didn't process what he was saying. Then he nodded toward the monitors behind the counter, the grainy black and white security footage cycling between different angles of the gas station. My car was on the screen, sitting there at Pump 4, and under it, barely visible in the shadows beneath the chassis, was a figure. Someone was lying under my car. I went completely still. The guy behind the counter kept his eyes on me, his voice calm but urgent. "He just crawled under there when you got out. He's still there. Just stay here, okay?" I swallowed hard, my heart slamming against my ribs. My mouth was suddenly dry. On the screen, the figure shifted, moved. Slowly, carefully, he began creeping toward the back of my car. Then he disappeared. I stared at the monitor, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see him anymore. I turned to the guy behind the counter. Where did he? Then, on another camera, a different angle there. The back door. The man was climbing into my car. It didn't seem real. It felt like watching a movie, like this wasn't actually happening to me, like any second now I'd wake up and realize I'd fallen asleep in my car at a red light. But it was real, and he was in my back seat. A sharp, sickening chill ran down my spine. I tried to focus, to think. What did he want? A carjacking? Robbery? Was he just trying to get out of the cold? The 911 call was still active. I could hear the low murmur of the dispatcher on the speaker, asking questions, the guy behind the counter giving quiet answers. I stood there, staring at the screen, gripping the edge of the counter so hard my fingers ached. And then, for the first time, I got a clear look at him. The security footage wasn't great, but it was enough. He was thin, disheveled, maybe homeless. He wore a tattered hoodie with the hood up, his face shadowed, but what stood out the most were his hands. He was wearing gloves, and in one of them, clutched tight, was a small knife. Not a big one, Not a huge, dramatic blade, just a small, simple pocket knife. But it didn't have to be big to be dangerous. The seconds crawled by. The clerk and I didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the screen, waiting for the red and blue lights of a police car to break through the darkness outside. And then, finally, sirens. Flashing lights. A patrol car pulled in fast, tires screeching. The man in my car must have seen it too because suddenly he moved. The camera angle shifted. He lunged forward, scrambling into the front seat, yanking at something. The door handle. He was trying to get out. The police were faster. The second they stopped, the doors flew open, and officers poured out, guns drawn, shouting commands. The clerk and I stood frozen, watching as they rushed my car, yanking the door open, dragging the man out. He fought, twisting, kicking, but they slammed him against the pavement, pinning him down. Then finally it was over. The man was cuffed, hauled to his feet. I stepped outside, my knees weak, my stomach churning. One of the officers walked over, asking if I was okay, if I had been hurt, if I had seen anything before coming inside. I told them everything. They found the knife, the gloves. They said he didn't have a wallet, no ID. He hadn't spoken a word. They didn't know what he had planned. Neither did I. But I knew one thing for sure. If the clerk hadn't seen him, if he hadn't called me inside, I would have gotten back in my car. I would have driven off. And I never would have known he was there. Until it was too late. That thought still keeps me awake some nights. The road to Ciudad Hidalgo was always a choice between two paths. One was the newer National Highway, a straight and efficient route that most people took. The other was Mil Cumbres, the road of 1,000 hills, a name that wasn't just poetic but accurate. A twisting, winding, stomach-turning road through the mountains, filled with sharp turns and switchbacks that could make even the most seasoned traveler feel uneasy. It was the old way, less traveled now, but my grandfather loved it. He loved the mountains, the endless stretches of dense forest, the way the land rolled over itself, like waves frozen in time. The national road was practical, sure, but Mil Cumbres was alive. It was something to experience, not just pass through. That evening, we were driving back to Ciudad Hidalgo after visiting Morelia. It was just me, my grandfather, and my grandmother. I sat in the back seat, watching the world blur by as we twisted through the mountains. The sun was sinking, its last light spilling across the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Soon, the only light would come from our headlights and the occasional glow of a distant town. I remember the quiet hum of the engine, the way the tires gripped the curves, how the car would lean slightly with each turn. My grandfather was completely in his element, hands firm on the wheel, eyes focused but relaxed. My grandmother sat beside him, quiet, occasionally glancing out the window. We had been driving for about 45 minutes when the darkness fully settled. The kind that felt thick, pressing in from all sides. There were no streetlights here, no other cars. Just us and the endless, winding road ahead. That's when my grandfather started to slow down. I leaned forward, gripping the back of the front seats, peering past them to see why. Up ahead, something was blocking the road. A tree. A thick, heavy log stretched across both lanes, its rough bark visible in the glow of our headlights. It hadn't fallen naturally. That much was obvious. It was too perfect, too deliberate. For a moment, no one moved. The car idled, its engine humming softly. My grandfather's hands tightened on the wheel. Then, without a word, he threw the car into reverse. The sudden motion knocked me back into my seat as we lurched backward, the tires spinning slightly before catching. My grandfather was a skilled driver, but even he knew that on a road like this, in the dark, reversing at high speed was dangerous. Still, he didn't hesitate. The car jerked as he turned the wheel, maneuvering us into a full 180-degree turn. Gravel crunched under the tires as we straightened out. Then he hit the gas. I was thrown back again, my heart pounding. I twisted around in my seat, looking out the rear window, my breath caught in my throat. That's when I saw them. Men, stepping out from the trees. They moved quickly, emerging from the darkness beyond our headlights. Flashlights flickered on, cutting through the night. The beams swept over the road, bouncing off the car's taillights. Some of them carried guns. Rifles slung over shoulders, others gripping shorter weapons. Even from a distance, I could see their faces, shrouded in the dim light, their features unreadable. But I didn't need to see them clearly to understand what was happening. This wasn't some unlucky accident. This was a trap. They had set the tree there. They had waited, and we had almost fallen for it. The car roared as my grandfather pushed the engine harder than I'd ever heard before. The tires struggled against the road, gripping tight as we sped away. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the men behind us. They weren't running. They didn't need to. They had planned for us to stop. They had been ready to surround the car, force us out. But my grandfather had reacted too fast. Their plan had fallen apart in an instant. Still, I half expected them to shoot. I held my breath, waiting for the crack of gunfire, for the windows to shatter, for the car to jerk as a tire blew out. But the shots never came. The last thing I saw before we rounded a curve and lost sight of them was one man, standing near the fallen tree, his flashlight casting a long beam of light across the pavement. He didn't run after us. He didn't raise his gun. He just stood there watching. We didn't stop driving. My grandfather didn't slow down, didn't say a word. The road blurred past us in the darkness, each curve taking us further away from whatever had been waiting back there. I couldn't tell how fast we were going, but it was too fast for Mill Cumbers. I felt every turn deep in my stomach, my body shifting with every curve. The silence in the car was suffocating. The engine roared. The tires hissed against the pavement. But none of us spoke. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of Ciudad Hidalgo, until the first streetlights flickered past the windows, until the road evened out, straightened, and became something familiar, that I realized I had been gripping the seat so hard my fingers ached. Only then did my grandfather finally slow down. The car eased into a normal pace, the tension in the air thinning, but not disappearing completely. We made it back to my grandparents' house without saying a single word about what had just happened. It was only after we pulled into the driveway, after the car was turned off and the silence became too loud to ignore, that my grandfather exhaled a long, slow breath. My grandmother sat still, hands folded in her lap. I stared out the window, watching the street outside, half expecting to see headlights coming up the road behind us. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of a town that had no idea what had almost happened that night. We never spoke about it. Not that night, not the next day, not ever, and we never took Mill Cumbers again. I had only been working for the carpentry business for a few weeks. Fresh out of high school, I didn't know much about the trade, but I was trying to learn. The guys I worked with were decent, and the job itself was fine, but I wasn't used to the long hours or the early mornings yet. My body ached constantly, my hands were always sore, and I was still getting used to how things worked. That morning, my boss called me earlier than usual. I was half asleep when I answered, my phone buzzing on my nightstand. "Hey, I need you to head over to the house we were at yesterday," he said. His voice was groggy, like he had just woken up too. "Just get some cleanup done, sort out the tools, and I'll send someone else over when I can." I said okay and got up. It wasn't unusual for me to be sent to a job site alone. We were a small crew, 6 guys total, and work had been picking up. There weren't always enough hands to send 2 guys to every site. I didn't mind being alone, but I was still new, and I never liked being the only one responsible for things. If I messed up, there was no one else to blame it on. By the time I pulled up to the house, the sun was barely over the trees. The place was a 2-story home in a half-finished neighborhood. A lot of the houses around it were still under construction. Some just frames, others nearly complete. This one was close to being done. The walls were up, the floors were in, but the basement was still unfinished, which was where most of our tools and supplies were. My boss was already there, standing by his truck, waiting for me. As soon as I got out, he walked over and pointed toward the house. "Just finish up down there. Clean out the buckets and organize the tools. That's all you gotta do." I nodded. "I'll check in later," he said, then got in his truck and left. I grabbed my stuff, took off my shoes at the door, and headed inside. The house smelled like sawdust and paint. It was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wood settling. The basement stairs were in the back of the house, past the kitchen. I had been down there before, so I knew what to expect. Unfinished walls, concrete floors, a few light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. It was a big space, but it felt cramped with all of our supplies lying around. As I started down the steps, I heard something. A noise from below. It sounded like panting. I stopped for a second, listening. It was faint but steady, like a dog was down there. I figured the family must have had a pet. Maybe it got trapped down there overnight. Not my problem. I'd let it out when I finished up. I kept walking. The air down there was cool, a little damp. The smell of wood and concrete was strong. The light was dim, but I could see well enough. I stepped over a few extension cords and went toward the corner where we kept the mud buckets. That's when I heard the bark. It was a sharp, deep sound that echoed off the unfinished walls. But something about it was wrong. It didn't sound like a real bark. It sounded like a person trying to imitate one. I froze. My first thought was that my boss had come back and was messing with me. He had a weird sense of humor and liked to joke around. I dropped the sponge I was holding and walked to the doorway. "Hey," I called out, half expecting to hear him laugh. Silence. No footsteps, no movement. Just the faint hum of electricity from the work lights. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't easily scared, but something about that noise made my skin crawl. I decided I was done. I didn't care about the buckets or the tools. I just wanted to get out of there. I turned to head upstairs when I heard it again. That same barking sound. But this time it was closer. I don't know why, but instead of running, I stepped forward toward one of the side rooms. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe a big dog, some stray that wandered in. Maybe my boss after all, crouched in the dark, waiting to jump out. But when I looked inside the room, my stomach dropped. There was something there. A large shape, hunched near the far wall. Its back was to me at first, but as I stepped closer, it turned. I have never felt fear like that before. It was a dog, or at least, it was shaped like a dog. But something was off. Its fur was short and patchy, like it didn't quite fit right over its body. Its limbs were too long, its paws splayed out strangely on the concrete. And its eyes, God, its eyes were all wrong. Too round, too human. It stared at me, and I stared back. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about it made sense. Then it opened its mouth. Its tongue lolled out, and for a second, it almost looked normal. But then it made that noise again. That bark. That horrible, human-like bark. I felt something deep in my gut twist. This wasn't a dog. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't a dog. I stepped back, my legs shaking. The thing didn't move. It just sat there, watching me. I turned and bolted. I didn't care about the buckets. I didn't care about the tools. I didn't even care about my shoes by the front door. I ran up the stairs, 2 at a time, nearly tripping over myself in my panic. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled the doorknob twice before I got the front door open. I sprinted to my truck, jumped in, and slammed the lock button. My heart was pounding, my chest rising and falling so fast I thought I was going to pass out. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Eventually, I forced myself to look back at the house. The front door was still open. The house was silent. Nothing followed me. Nothing came up those stairs. After a while, I forced myself to start the truck and drive away. I didn't go back to that house. When my boss called me later, asking why I left, I lied. I said I wasn't feeling well. He was annoyed but didn't push it. The next day, when the other guys went back to finish the job, I asked them if they saw anything. They said no. No dog. No weird noises. Nothing. But I know what I saw. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't just a dog. And I hope I never see anything like it again. The cabin had always been a second home to us. Nestled deep in the Alps, far from any town or main road, it was a place our family gathered every summer. My uncle had built it himself, a simple wooden shack with a tin roof, a wood-burning stove, and just enough space inside for a handful of people to sleep. But with so many relatives coming for the weekend, the shack was never big enough. The adults took the cabin, and the kids always ended up in tents behind it. That was just how it went. This time was no different. A big family dinner had brought us all together, with our younger cousins running around, the older ones helping prepare food, and the adults sitting inside, drinking and reminiscing. The air smelled like grilled meat and pine, and the soft hum of cicadas mixed with distant laughter. It was one of those perfect summer nights, warm, peaceful, and familiar. But as the evening stretched on, a feeling of unease settled over our little group. It started with the sounds. The forest surrounding the cabin was thick, with towering trees blocking out the moonlight. During the day, it was a paradise of mossy trails and hidden clearings, but at night, it became a wall of darkness. And from that darkness came noises, low, guttural sounds, like an animal moving just beyond the tree line. Scratching, snapping twigs, heavy, deliberate steps. At first, we brushed it off. It was easy to imagine things when you were camping, especially when the only light came from the dim glow of a fire and a few flashlights. But the younger cousins weren't convinced. Every so often, one of them would sit bolt upright in their sleeping bag, wide-eyed and pale, whispering, "Did you hear that?" By midnight, they were done. One by one, they abandoned their tents, rushing back inside the cabin, their little faces filled with fear. My uncle shook his head and laughed, thinking they were just being dramatic. But my oldest cousin and I, we knew better, because we had planned the whole thing. The idea had come to us earlier that day, when we checked the wild camera. My cousin had set it up years ago, mounting it high on a tree near the shack. It worked with a motion sensor, snapping photos whenever something moved in front of it. Sometimes it caught deer, foxes, or even the occasional hiker. But most of the time, it was just empty frames of waving grass and shifting shadows. That afternoon, after a long hike, we stopped by the camera to check its latest shots. Nothing exciting, just a few blurred images of birds and branches swaying in the wind. But that's when we had the idea. We had a radio, an old one from the cabin's living room. My cousin had a CD he'd made, filled with random wildlife noises he'd ripped from YouTube. Everything from tiger roars to eerie howls that had no place in the Alps. The plan was simple: sneak into the woods, blast the sounds, and scare the younger cousins. But we wanted to go further. We needed proof. Something that would make the prank last long after the night was over. That's when my cousin grabbed an axe from the shed and handed it to me. "Walk past the wild camera on the way back," he said, grinning. "Make it look creepy." That night, around 12:30 a.m., we slipped out of our tents and into the woods. The radio was bulky but lightweight, and we carried it in a backpack, taking slow, careful steps through the underbrush. The forest was silent, eerily so. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. We found a spot about 50 meters from the cabin, placed the radio on the ground, and turned the volume up. At first, nothing happened. Then the sound started. A distant growl, a sharp, guttural roar, the eerie screech of some unknown bird. The effect was immediate. Back at the campsite, we heard rustling. Someone stirred in their tent. My cousin stifled a laugh. We let the sounds play for about 20 minutes before turning the radio off. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Then, on the way back, I made sure to pass right in front of the wild camera. The axe was heavy in my hands, its wooden handle warm from my grip. I pulled my hoodie low over my face, making sure it hid every feature. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, I walked past the camera, pausing just long enough for it to capture the perfect shot. The next morning, the younger cousins were still spooked. They told the adults about the noises, but the grown-ups just laughed it off. After breakfast, we decided to take a hike, and naturally, we made our way to the wild camera. My cousin climbed up the tree and retrieved the memory card. We crowded around as he clicked through the photos. Birds, trees, the usual. Then, the first shot of me appeared. The younger kids gasped. In the picture, I stood at the edge of the clearing, an axe slung over my shoulder, my face completely obscured by the hood. The next shot showed me closer, then closer still. One of the younger cousins panicked. He ran back toward the cabin, shouting for his parents. The others followed, terrified. At first, we laughed. It was the perfect prank. The older cousins clapped me on the back, telling me how convincing I looked. But then my cousin's face changed. He squinted at the screen. "Wait, how many pictures did we take?" "4 or 5, I said. He flipped through them again. There were 6. I frowned. Maybe it caught an extra one when I walked past. But as we stared at the screen, a sick feeling crept into my stomach. The last photo wasn't of me. The figure in the final picture stood just beyond the camera's range, half hidden by the trees. It looked like me, same stance, same axe, but the proportions were off. The shoulders were broader, the legs longer. The hood was pulled lower, and something about the way it stood felt wrong. We hadn't taken that picture. The cabin was in chaos by the time we got back. Our little cousins were hysterical, and their parents were trying to calm them down. My uncle grabbed the memory card, plugged it into his laptop, and clicked through the images. His face went pale when he reached the last one. No one spoke. No one laughed. The camera had caught someone else that night. Someone who hadn't been part of our prank. Someone who had walked the same path as me, carrying the same axe, not long after we'd gone to bed. We never figured out who it was. That night, we all slept inside the cabin. The tent stayed empty. And the wild camera? My uncle took it down the next morning. The heath was where we spent most of our childhood. It was wild and overgrown, with thick patches of gorse and tangled brambles that scratched your arms if you weren't careful. The land stretched wide and uneven, with dips and rises that made it feel endless. There were little hidden spots where we'd build dens and pretend to be explorers, and in the summer, when the air shimmered with heat, we'd lie on the dry grass and listen to the hum of insects around us. But right in the middle of the heath, half hidden by the slope of the land and the overgrown hedges, stood the water house. It was ancient, long abandoned, yet somehow it still worked. The estate's water system ran through it, the pipes groaning deep inside the old brick walls. The building itself was crumbling, the slate roof sagging in places, the once solid iron doors missing, leaving only gaping openings. Every window was shattered, jagged glass long since replaced by empty frames. It was a place we never spoke around. Not because anyone told us not to, but because it just felt wrong. Even the older boys, who were fearless in every other way, kept their distance. It was a rule that didn't need saying. Our mothers had played on the heath as kids, and they'd told us how it spooked them too. Their stories weren't about ghosts, none of that fairy tale nonsense, but about the deep, gut-level unease that the place gave them. That was enough for us. It was a blistering hot day in the school holidays when we set off blackberry picking. The older boys had volunteered to take us, partly because we were being a nuisance at home, partly because they liked any excuse to get outside. HB and they were 16, 17, and 18, old enough to be trusted to watch us younger ones. They'd babysat us plenty of times before, and we knew the rules. Stay close, do what they said, no wandering off. There were 5 of us younger kids, and we were already buzzing with excitement by the time we left Gran's house. Her back garden led straight onto the heath. There was a wooden fence with a gap at the end where we could squeeze through. One of the older boys passed me through first, then lifted my small wheelchair over before helping the others. In seconds, we were off. The older boys told stories as we walked, spinning out the eerie legends of the heath. They were good at it, too, B and H especially. They knew how to set the scene, how to make you feel the weight of the silence before something terrible happened. But as soon as the Waterhouse came into view, the stories stopped. The whole group fell quiet. We never spoke near it. The heath felt different here. The air was too still, too thick, like the weight of a coming storm pressing down on us. Even the insects seemed quieter, their buzzing dampened in the heavy air. We walked faster, eyes down, squeezing through the second fence that led to the blackberry fields. It was only once we were well past the Waterhouse that we let ourselves breathe properly again. Only then did some of us risk glancing back at it. The blackberry fields were as perfect as ever. The bushes were thick with fruit, the sun was warm, and the river was low enough to splash in. There were other kids from the estate already there, their fingers stained purple from the berries. We filled our buckets, ate as many as we picked, and ran through the shallow water, letting the cold soak into our skin. The afternoon stretched on lazily, and before we knew it, the sun was sinking lower in the sky. H called out that it was time to go. None of us argued. We were tired, our legs scratched from the brambles, our arms sticky with berry juice. The walk home started much like the walk there, full of laughter, tired but content. But as we neared the Waterhouse again, the mood shifted. The air felt wrong. The stillness had returned, heavier than before. We reached the fence, and B lifted my wheelchair over first. H got me out, passing me through to the other side. The younger kids were already through waiting. Then a spoke. Something in his voice made every hair on my arms rise. It was low, uneasy. He'd seen something move at the back of the Waterhouse. He hesitated. I was the type to play tricks, to wind people up for a laugh. But he wasn't laughing now. He stepped forward. He swore under his breath and followed. H had already taken me out of my wheelchair again. He told everyone to run. I didn't see what I saw, but I heard his scream. It was a raw, sharp sound, fear and disgust tangled together. Then B grabbed the wheelchair, folding it up as he ran, and H threw me onto his shoulders. The younger kids screamed as they shoved them ahead, all of us tearing away from the fence at full speed. "Don't look back," I yelled. I did. There was nothing. Just the dark shape of the Waterhouse, the broken windows staring like empty eyes. We ran harder, lungs burning, feet slamming against the dry ground. The fence leading back to the estate loomed ahead. Only when we could see the houses beyond it, the safety of streetlights and voices, did we stop. We were gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. He leaned against the railing, hands on his knees, face pale. "What did you see, eh?" I hesitated, eyes darting back toward the heath. "Yellow eyes," he finally muttered. "Hairy face." The younger kids burst into panicked cries, and H had to calm them down. When we got home, we must have looked a mess, scratched up, shaken, our clothes stained with sweat and berry juice. Mama and my auntie noticed immediately, asking what had happened. H spoke for us all. He kept it simple. Some old drunk in the bushes looking for golf balls. That was common enough on the heath. It made sense. Mama and my auntie gave us a lecture about staying aware, but they weren't too worried. We never told them the truth. We never found out what I saw. But none of us went near the Waterhouse for a long time after that. Even now, years later, I still dream about it sometimes. The dry, heavy air before a storm. The empty windows staring. The sharp, terrified scream breaking the stillness. And the yellow eyes, watching from the dark. I knew it was a bad idea. From the moment I saw the library doors shut, the sign taped over the entrance reading "Closed for emergency maintenance," my stomach twisted with regret. My whole plan was built around pulling an all-nighter there, cramming as much last-minute revision as I could before my final exam. It wasn't the most responsible plan, but it had worked before. Now, though, I was stranded. The contract for my student accommodation had ended the week before, leaving me technically homeless for the last stretch of the exam season. Most of my friends had already gone home, and crashing at someone's place last minute wasn't an option. The best thing I could do was book a hotel for the night, get some studying done there, and show up to my exam with at least some revision fresh in my mind. I pulled out my phone, scanning for nearby hotels. Everything was expensive, way more than I could afford. Then I saw one that was surprisingly cheap for a last-minute booking. It was further than I would have liked, nearly a 30-minute walk, but I didn't have many options. The price was tempting, and I convinced myself it would be fine for one night. The streets were quiet as I walked. Too quiet. The usual city noise, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional group of people passing by, was missing. Instead, there was only the sound of my own footsteps, echoing against the pavement. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, feeling the creeping unease that comes with walking alone at night. There was nothing behind me, just darkness stretching down the long road. The hotel finally came into view at the end of the street, a dimly lit Victorian-style building standing tall against the night. Relief flooded through me. At least I would be inside soon. At least I would be safe. I stepped inside and immediately noticed how empty it felt. There was no one at the reception desk. The lobby was dimly lit, the air stale like it hadn't been cleaned properly in years. The old wooden floors creaked beneath my feet. I rang the bell on the counter. Nothing. I rang it again, tapping my fingers impatiently. Just as I was about to call out, a movement at the top of the staircase caught my eye. A man stood there, staring down at me. Tall, with an awkward frame, his face half hidden in shadow. Something about him felt off. His posture was stiff, unnatural, as if he had been standing there for a long time waiting. I hesitated before asking, "Do you work here?" His response was immediate. "No, just a guest." Then he started asking questions. Where was I from? Was I staying here alone? Why was I here so late? I kept my answers vague, but he kept pressing. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was studying me, as if he was trying to figure something out. After what felt like forever, he turned and disappeared up the stairs. Moments later, I heard loud banging, followed by muffled shouting. The receptionist finally appeared, an older man who looked tired and uninterested in his job. I quickly booked my room, trying to ignore the lingering feeling of unease. My room was on the second floor. As I climbed the stairs, I passed by the room next to mine, where I heard more knocking and hushed voices. My nerves were on edge. I shut my door and locked it immediately. I sat on the bed, trying to shake off the weird feeling in my gut. I told myself I was overthinking things, that the guy was probably just socially awkward. But my instincts told me something else. Then came the knock. Slow, deliberate. I hesitated, my body frozen in place. Another knock. I stood up, heart pounding, and cracked the door open just enough to see. It was him. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Are you alone?" I forced my voice to sound casual. "No, my friend's coming over in a few minutes." A lie. His expression flickered, as if calculating something. Then, in the most unnatural way, he asked, "Can I come in?" I shut the door. A second later, I felt the weight of him pushing against it. I shoved back, using my whole body to force it closed, twisting the lock with shaking hands. The pressure against the door stopped. Silence. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. I sat on the bed, trying to calm myself down. My heart was racing, my mind running in circles. I told myself he was gone. Maybe I had scared him off. I put on a YouTube video to distract myself. Then I heard it again, knocking. Not on my door this time, but on the one next to mine. Then silence. Then loud, violent banging. The walls shook. The sound of wood splintering filled the air, followed by screaming. I felt sick. I could hear thrashing, more shouting. Something heavy hit the floor. My hands were trembling as I sat there, frozen in place, not knowing what to do. Then sirens. I didn't even realize someone had called the police until I heard the commotion outside. Footsteps rushed through the hallway, voices shouting commands. The police arrived just in time. The man was gone. He had vanished before they could catch him. Later, I learned from the guy next door that the man had broken into his room with knives and machetes. He had intended to kill someone that night. He was a prime suspect in a string of past murders, though they had never caught him. I gave my statement to the police, my hands still shaking as I signed my name. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know if they ever caught him. But I do know one thing. I will never, ever stay in a cheap hotel again. I had stayed up too late again. It was a bad habit, but one I couldn't seem to break. The hours between midnight and sunrise felt different, almost unreal. The world outside slowed down, and inside, bathed in the glow of my screen, I could lose myself completely. That night was no different. I had settled in with my controller, a half-empty bottle of soda beside me, and the only sound in the apartment was the faint hum of electronics and the occasional click of buttons. My ex was in the bedroom, out cold. She'd had surgery earlier that week, and the pain meds knocked her out deeper than usual. Normally, she was a light sleeper. I was too, but when I gamed all night, exhaustion caught up to me fast. It was one of those nights where time had slipped away from me. I glanced at the clock, 4:30 a.m. I sighed, rubbing my eyes, knowing I'd regret this in the morning. I stretched, shut down the console, and got up, my back aching from hours of sitting in the same position. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in just before dawn. It felt unnatural, but I chalked it up to sleep deprivation. I made my way through the living room, stepping over the cat's toys, feeling the slight chill of early morning air seeping in from the back door. I had left it cracked open because the cat was out, something I did more often than I should have. It was a stupid habit. I knew that, but I never expected anything to come of it. I locked the door behind me, double-checking that it was secure, then shuffled into the bedroom. I pushed the door shut behind me, not wanting the cat to jump onto the bed and disturb my ex. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of the alarm clock on her side of the bed. I climbed in, letting out a long breath as my body sank into the mattress. Sleep hit me hard. I woke up to my ex shifting beside me. It was 6 a.m. Barely an hour and a half had passed. My head felt heavy, my body unwilling to move. I was still deep in that half-conscious state when she sat up. She mumbled something, then got out of bed. I was too groggy to register what she was saying, only that her voice sounded confused. Then, the mattress shifted again, and I heard the bedroom door creak open. That was the moment something felt off. I had shut that door. The exhaustion drained from me instantly. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. My ex's footsteps moved through the apartment. Then silence. A few seconds later, I heard her voice again, sharper this time. I swung my legs off the bed and stood, my stomach knotting. The air felt different, heavier. I stepped into the hallway, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and then I saw her standing frozen in the living room. The apartment was a mess. Drawers had been pulled open, their contents dumped onto the floor. The coffee table had been shifted, the couch cushions tossed aside. The entertainment stand, where my console had been just 2 hours earlier, was empty. My stomach dropped. We had been robbed. It didn't make sense. The locks were still in place. There was no broken glass, no forced entry. It took a few more seconds before realization dawned on me. The back door. I had locked it, but I had left it open before that. Someone had been inside while we slept. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. I took a step back, my skin crawling, my mind racing through the possibilities. I checked the bedroom. The closet doors were still closed. No one was hiding, but someone had been there. Someone had moved through our home, taken our things, and left without waking us up. I didn't want to think about what that meant. The next few hours were a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. The police arrived quickly. My ex's father was a sergeant, so that helped. They took everything seriously. They went through the apartment, asking us questions, checking for fingerprints. It was only when they started their search outside that things got worse. Out in the backyard, inside the small shed we barely used, they found it. An empty case of beer, some cigarette butts, and the unmistakable signs that someone had been sitting there for a while. The realization was sickening. They had been watching us, waiting. They had sat in our backyard, drinking, smoking, waiting for me to finally go to sleep. The thought made my skin crawl. I replayed the night in my head over and over. The unlocked door. The 2-hour window where I had been unconscious, dead to the world. The open bedroom door in the morning. At some point, they had come inside. At some point, they had looked in on us. The cops worked fast. The evidence pointed to a specific group they had been tracking, a gang that had been responsible for a string of home invasions. But these weren't just burglars. They weren't breaking in for quick cash or electronics. They had killed people. The officers didn't go into detail at first, but when they finally caught them, the truth came out. This group wasn't just robbing homes. They were choosing their victims carefully. Some they left alone. Some they didn't. We had been on that list. The only reason we weren't dead was a combination of dumb luck and timing. My ex's pain medication had knocked her out. I had been up all night, making it seem like someone in the house was still awake. That was enough to make them wait. They had watched from the shed, drinking, until they saw the last light go out. Then they came in, and for whatever reason, they had stood in our bedroom, looked at us, and decided we weren't worth the trouble. That single thought haunted me more than anything else. Not that we had been robbed. Not that they had been inside our home, but that they had watched us, stood over us, considered their options, and then walked away. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep right. Every sound in the night felt like a warning. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I found myself waking up at 4:30 a.m., staring at the bedroom door, waiting for it to open. I changed my habits. The back door was never left open again, not even for a second. The locks were double-checked, triple-checked. My console didn't hold my attention like it used to. I stopped staying up late. But the worst part was knowing that they had been there, so close, and had chosen to leave us alive. Not because of any sense of morality. Not because they had been caught. But because, in that moment, we just weren't worth the effort. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. That night was just like any other. I was driving to see a girl I liked during her overnight shift at the hospital. I had done it before, left my place late, taken the same roads, crossed the same intersections. It wasn't a long drive, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour at most if I hit a few red lights. I was tired, sure, but not exhausted. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't high, I wasn't sick. Nothing was wrong. It was just a normal night. I remember the streetlights casting long, orange glows over the quiet neighborhoods. I remember rolling my window down a little to let in the cool air. It had rained earlier in the day, and the pavement still had that damp smell to it, like wet earth and asphalt. I remember thinking about what I'd say to her when I got there, how I'd surprise her at the front desk, maybe bring her a coffee. I was feeling good. Normal. The last thing I remember was approaching a four-way stop in the middle of a residential area. Just another intersection. I had been through it 100 times before. No other cars were around, no headlights in the distance. The houses were dark except for a few porch lights, the kind that flicker every so often when a moth gets too close. I let off the gas, foot hovering over the brake. Then nothing. It wasn't like falling asleep. It wasn't like fainting or spacing out or losing track of time. There was no slow fade, no sense that I was slipping away. I was there, and then I wasn't. A cut in reality. 1 second I was driving, and the next I was standing in someone's yard, barefoot in the damp grass, staring at a woman who was screaming at me from her front porch. I didn't feel disoriented right away. That came later. The first thing I noticed, really noticed, was the way the grass felt under my feet. Cold, slightly muddy. My toes sank into the earth a little. Then I heard her voice, sharp and panicked, cutting through the quiet night. "What is wrong with you?" My body stiffened, like it had been caught doing something it shouldn't. The sound of her yelling forced my brain into action, but everything felt sluggish, like wading through thick water. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of where I was, why I was there. Behind the woman, a kid was standing just inside the doorway, half hidden behind her leg. The porch light above them threw strange shadows across their faces. I turned my head, looked back toward the street, and that's when I saw my truck. It was sitting right in the middle of the intersection, still running. The driver's side door was wide open, like I had just stepped out and wandered away. My shoes and socks were on the ground next to it, scattered haphazardly on the pavement, as if I had kicked them off in a hurry. The headlights were still on, casting long beams across the road and into the yards ahead. My stomach dropped. Something was wrong. I felt my breathing pick up, my chest tightening. My legs felt unsteady, like I wasn't supposed to be standing there, like my body wasn't my own. My mind raced, trying to grasp onto anything that made sense. I had been driving. I had been awake. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't sick. I wasn't tired. How did I get here? I forced myself to move. My legs felt stiff, like they had been in one position for too long. I took a step toward my truck, then another. My bare feet slapped against the pavement as I crossed the street. The woman was still yelling, but her words blurred together, noise more than meaning. I reached the driver's side, stared down at my shoes and socks. I picked them up, my fingers trembling. They were slightly damp from the pavement. I glanced back at the woman one last time. She hadn't moved from the porch. The kid was still behind her. The way she was looking at me, it was like she thought I was dangerous, like I was some kind of threat. I wasn't, but I must have looked like one. I climbed into the truck and shut the door. My hands gripped the steering wheel. My fingers were shaking. The engine was still running. I put the truck in drive and forced myself to move, rolling slowly through the intersection, my headlights sweeping across houses and parked cars. I didn't look back. I drove straight home. I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't stop for coffee. I didn't check my phone. I just went home, locked my door, and sat on my bed, my shoes still in my hands, my socks balled up between my fingers. I stared at them, like they might tell me something, like they might explain what had happened. They didn't. The next day, I retraced my steps. I drove the same route, slowed at the same four-way stop. Nothing about it felt strange. It was just a normal intersection, quiet, unremarkable. The woman's house was still there. The yard looked the same. No signs that anything had happened the night before. But something had. I went to a doctor, then a neurologist. They ran tests, asked me questions. Had I been under stress? Had I experienced anything like this before? Did I have a history of seizures? Sleepwalking? No. They found nothing. It was an isolated event, they said. No signs of a neurological disorder. No explanation. Just a gap. A blackout. The kind of thing that shouldn't happen. But it did. And the worst part, it hasn't happened again. That should be comforting, but it's not. If it had happened again, at least I'd have something to go on. A pattern. A clue. But instead, it remains a singular moment, frozen in time, impossible to understand. I think about it every day. I think about my truck sitting in the intersection, the door open, the engine running. I think about my bare feet on the pavement, my socks and shoes scattered beside me. I think about that woman's face, the way she screamed at me, the way she held her child behind her like she was afraid of me. And I think about the time in between, the empty space, the part where I was gone. I was 10 years old the night I saw something I'll never forget. My grandpa and I were driving to a ranch in Mexico, deep into the countryside where the roads stretched long and empty between scattered villages and endless fields. It was the middle of the night, 3:40 in the morning, to be exact. The world was dark and still, with only the hum of my grandpa's old blue Ford pickup truck breaking the silence. We had left my grandparents' house a little over an hour earlier. I was barely awake when my grandpa shook me gently and told me it was time to go. My grandma packed us food for the road, wrapping tamales and tortillas in cloth and placing them in a small basket. She gave me a tired smile before kissing my forehead and telling me to be careful. My grandpa, always quiet but sharp, checked the truck before we left, making sure everything was in order before starting the long drive. I remember the air outside being cold. Even in Mexico, the early morning hours before sunrise held a certain chill, especially in the open countryside where the wind had nothing to block its path. I pulled my hoodie tighter around me as I climbed into the passenger seat of the truck, my legs barely long enough to reach the edge of the seat. My grandpa shifted the truck into gear, and we pulled out onto the dirt road leading away from the house. For the first hour or so, the drive was quiet. The headlights stretched out ahead of us, illuminating the cracked pavement and occasional pothole. There weren't many streetlights out here, only darkness and the occasional glow of a distant ranch or the flicker of a passing farmhouse window. The only other lights came from the truck's dashboard, casting a soft green glow over my grandpa's weathered hands as he gripped the steering wheel. I was groggy, struggling to keep my eyes open as the steady motion of the truck made me want to drift back to sleep. But my grandpa was wide awake, focused on the road ahead. He had driven this route countless times before, taking supplies out to the ranch and making the long trip back before sunrise. At some point, he broke the silence. "This road is haunted," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "They say a woman stands on the side of the road asking for rides." I felt my stomach drop. I was just a kid, and anything having to do with ghosts or spirits terrified me. My family had always told stories about strange things happening in the countryside, but I never really believed them, at least not until that night. I turned to look out the window, suddenly wide awake. The road stretched on endlessly, the darkness beyond the headlights thick and impenetrable. I stared hard, scanning the edges of the road for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the occasional shape of a bush or a fence post, barely visible in the dim light. For the next 40 minutes, I couldn't relax. The sky was still dark, with no sign of the sun rising anytime soon. The only sound was the rumble of the truck's tires against the road and the occasional bump when we hit a pothole. My grandpa seemed fine, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression calm. But then I noticed something. He kept looking at the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was an experienced driver, always checking his surroundings. But the more I watched, the more I noticed something was off. His glances became more frequent, his eyes flicking up to the mirror every few seconds. His grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so slightly. I swallowed hard and finally worked up the courage to ask, "What's wrong?" He didn't look at me. He just kept his eyes on the road and shook his head. Nothing, but I knew he was lying. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. My chest felt tight, my hands clammy. My stomach twisted as I slowly turned my head toward the rearview mirror, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And that's when I saw her. A woman. She was sitting in the back of our truck. She wasn't just a blur or a shadow. I saw her clearly. A white dress, long and flowing, almost glowing in the darkness. Her hair was long and unkempt, tangled around her shoulders. But the worst part, the part that made my breath catch in my throat, was her eyes. They were pitch black. Not just dark, but completely void, like two empty sockets where eyes should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, staring at her through the mirror, frozen in place. My body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the seat. I don't know how long I sat like that, my heart pounding, my mind racing, trying to convince myself that I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. Then my grandpa looked in the mirror again, and he saw her too. He slammed on the brakes so hard that I lurched forward, barely catching myself against the dashboard. The tires screeched against the pavement, the truck jerking violently as we skidded to a stop. Dust and gravel kicked up around us, swirling in the red glow of the taillights. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there, gripping the seats, breathing hard. Slowly, we turned to look at each other. I could see it in his face. He had seen her. He wasn't just humoring me or playing a trick. He was scared. My grandpa, a man who had worked with his hands his whole life, who had faced every danger imaginable on these roads, was scared. We turned back to the mirror. She was gone. The truck bed was empty. Just the tarp covering the supplies and the basket my grandma had packed for us. Nothing else. I didn't know what to say. My hands were still shaking, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My grandpa didn't say anything either. He just reached for the door handle, and stepped out of the truck. I hesitated before following him. The night air was cold, colder than before. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, rustling the dry grass along the roadside. I stepped carefully, my legs still unsteady, and looked around. Nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there at all. Just the empty road stretching out behind us. Then I noticed something else. We were inches away from disaster. Our truck had stopped just short of a deep ditch on the side of the road. If my grandpa hadn't hit the brakes when he did, we would have gone straight into it. The front tires were barely a foot from the edge, the ground sloping down into darkness. I stepped closer, peering over the edge. It wasn't just a small dip in the ground, it was deep. The kind of fall that could have flipped the truck, maybe even killed us. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. We stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the ditch, staring at the empty truck bed, staring at the road stretching into the darkness. Then, without a word, my grandpa turned and climbed back into the truck. I followed, shutting the door and pulling my seatbelt tight. He started the engine, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than before. We didn't say anything. We just drove. We never took that road again. I was 12 years old when it happened, and even now, thinking back on it makes my skin crawl. It wasn't the first time something had felt off in that house, but it was the first time I knew for sure that I wasn't imagining things. My dad saw it too. That was what made it real. That was what made it terrifying. It was just a normal evening. My dad was in his bedroom, lying back on his bed, flipping through channels on the old boxy TV we had back then. The glow from the screen cast a dim, flickering light across the room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my legs dangling over the side, absent-mindedly listening to whatever show he had landed on while we talked about random things. School, sports, whatever came to mind. The room itself was pretty simple, off-white walls, a wooden dresser against one side, and the closet on the opposite wall. The closet was open, and inside, in the dimness, I could see my mom folding clothes. She always folded clothes in there. It was one of those deep walk-in closets, big enough that you could step inside and move around a little. The light was off, but with the bedroom light on, we could still see her clearly. She was moving in her usual way, methodically picking up shirts, folding them with quick, practiced motions, setting them aside, then grabbing another. Her hair was up in a bun, as always. At some point, my dad called out to her. He asked her something. I don't even remember what, but she didn't respond. That wasn't too weird. She got really focused when she was doing something, so maybe she just hadn't heard him. He called her again. No response. He called her a third time, louder this time, his tone sharper, more impatient. Still nothing. Now he was annoyed. My dad didn't like repeating himself. His voice rose, frustration seeping into it, demanding her attention. I glanced toward the closet, expecting her to turn around or say something, but she just kept folding, like she didn't hear him at all. It was weird. Really weird. Something about the way she was moving started to feel off. Like she was going through the motions, but not really there. The more I watched, the more I realized I couldn't actually see her face. The angle of the light and the shadows from the clothes around her kept her features hidden. But I could still see her bun, the shape of her body, the way she moved. My dad was getting mad now. He yelled her name. And then, from behind me, I heard footsteps. I turned my head, and there was my mom, walking into the room from the hallway, fresh out of the shower, a towel wrapped around her. I froze. My dad froze. For a long second, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. Then I whipped my head back toward the closet. Empty. There was nothing there. The pile of unfolded clothes was still sitting where it had been, untouched. There was no one in the closet. No sign that anyone had been in there at all. My stomach dropped. I felt cold all over. My dad sat up straight, his face pale, his eyes locked on that empty space. He looked shaken, and my dad never looked shaken. I turned back to my mom. She was standing there, looking at us both like we'd lost our minds. She had no idea what just happened, and I didn't know how to explain it. The thing is, if I had been alone, I would have convinced myself I had imagined it. A trick of the light, my mind playing games with me, something. Anything rational. But my dad saw it too. We both saw it. And we both knew, without saying a word to each other, that whatever had been in that closet, whatever we had both seen, standing there, folding clothes, was not my mom. That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did my dad. He never talked about it after that. Not once. If I ever tried to bring it up, he would just shake his head and change the subject. But I know what I saw, and I know he saw it too. When I was 11 years old, I couldn't sleep. Not because I didn't want to, not because I wasn't tired. I wanted to sleep more than anything. But the moment the lights went out, I would feel them. It started small. I'd be lying in bed, trying to settle in, but something about the darkness would feel wrong. My room was the same as it always was, a small space, just big enough for my bed, a dresser, and my desk pushed up against the wall near the window. I had a closet in the corner, the door never quite shutting right. There was nothing unusual about it. But when the lights went out, I could feel something watching me. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. I'd lay there with my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep. But every night, at some point, I would break. I'd open my eyes, and they would be there. The first time I saw them, I thought my vision was playing tricks on me. The room was dark, but there in the corners, near my closet, under my desk, I could make out shapes. Human-like, but not quite. Their heads were too round, their shoulders too narrow, their limbs too long. I could only make out faint details at first, but the longer I stared, the clearer they became. Beady white eyes, round and reflective, like the glow of an animal caught in headlights. And their mouths, too wide, filled with too many teeth, stretched into grins that never moved. I froze, my body locking up so completely that even breathing felt dangerous. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that if I closed my eyes, if I stayed still, they would disappear. But even with my eyes shut, I felt them. They never moved at first. They only watched. Every night, it was the same. They would be there the moment I opened my eyes. At first, I thought it was just my closet. Maybe I had left the door open just enough to let my mind play tricks on me. So one night, before bed, I made sure the closet door was shut tight. I even pushed my dresser in front of it, just to be sure. But that night, they weren't in my closet. They were at the foot of my bed. The next night, they were closer. I tried everything. Sleeping with the lights on, burying my head under my blankets, facing the wall so I wouldn't have to see them. But it never helped. I could feel them even when I couldn't see them. And no matter how I positioned myself, no matter how tightly I shut my eyes, I always ended up opening them. And they were always there. I told myself they weren't real, that if I ignored them, they would go away. But they didn't. It got worse. One night, I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't remember what I had been dreaming about, but the fear clung to me, thick and suffocating. I turned my head, barely breathing. They were still there. But this time, one of them had moved. It was standing right beside my bed. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. I wanted to move, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. My eyes darted across the room, scanning the shadows. There were more of them now. Not just in the corners, but along the walls, by my desk, near the window. They stood still, their white eyes locked on me, their faces frozen in those awful grins. The one closest to me leaned in. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was inches from my face, its head tilted as if studying me. I waited for it to do something, anything, but it didn't. It just watched. I don't remember what happened after that. I must have passed out, or maybe my mind just shut down. All I know is that when I woke up, the sun was rising, and I was alone. After that, I started sleeping on the couch in the living room. I told my mom I just liked falling asleep to the TV, but that was a lie. I just couldn't be in that room anymore. The living room felt safer, but only for a while. Eventually, they found me there too. I stopped sleeping altogether. I would lie awake for hours, forcing myself not to close my eyes. But exhaustion always won. And every time I woke up, I would find them standing just a little closer. It got to the point where I didn't want to be in the house at all. I spent as much time outside as I could, playing at the park until the streetlights came on, riding my bike until my legs burned. But no matter how much time I spent outside, I always had to come home. I always had to face the night. And then one day they left. I don't know why. I don't know what changed. I woke up one morning and realized that, for the first time in what felt like forever, I had slept through the night. I didn't feel watched. I didn't wake up gasping for air. I didn't see them. I moved to a new house a year later, and they never followed me. But sometimes late at night, when I wake up for no reason, when the room is just a little too quiet, when the darkness feels a little too thick. I think I see them. Not like before. Not standing in my room. Just a glimpse. A shape in the corner of my vision. A flash of white eyes in the dark. A toothy grin, gone the moment I try to focus on it. And every time, I wonder if they ever really left. Or if they're just waiting. I had been working at the theater for a few months. It wasn't a great job, but it was easy. Minimum wage, long hours, and people leaving their trash everywhere, but I didn't mind too much. The worst part was dealing with customers, people sneaking in, teenagers throwing popcorn everywhere, and sometimes the occasional drunk or high person causing a scene. The area had a drug problem, so we saw a lot of weird people coming in off the street. Some were just looking for a place to sit down, others were more unpredictable. Most of my shifts were at night. I'd come in around 5 or 6 p.m., help with concessions if needed, then spend the rest of the night cleaning theaters after each movie. It was simple. Wait for people to leave, sweep up popcorn, wipe the seats if needed, and check for any trash left behind. On slower nights, it was peaceful. Just me, a broom, and the empty seats. But sometimes things got uncomfortable, like the night in Theater 6. That night, I was on my usual cleaning shift. Most of the movies had finished, and only a couple of late screenings were left. Theater 6 had played some thriller movie, something about a guy being stalked. I didn't watch the movies while working, but I always caught bits and pieces while waiting outside. I leaned against the wall near the entrance, checking my phone as I waited for the last few people to leave. One by one, the audience trickled out. Some moved quickly, probably needing to use the restroom. Others lingered, chatting about the movie as they made their way toward the lobby. A couple of stragglers walked out, and after a few minutes, it looked empty. I stepped inside. The theater was almost silent, just the faint hum of the projector cooling down and the distant sound of a vacuum from another theater. The lights had come up slightly, just enough to see the rows of seats, but the top row was still dark. The way the lighting was set up, shadows clung to the uppermost seats, leaving them barely visible. I started my usual routine, sweeping up popcorn and picking up empty cups. Row by row, I worked my way upward. My footsteps were the only sound, the soft scuff of my shoes on the sticky floor. Halfway through, I looked up. Someone was still sitting in the top row. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure sat completely still, just a silhouette against the faint glow from the hallway. No movement, no sound. Just sitting there. I hesitated. People sometimes fell asleep during movies, and drunks would occasionally pass out in their seats. I figured it was just some guy who hadn't noticed the movie was over. Still, something felt off. He wasn't slumped over like a sleeping person. He was sitting straight up, perfectly still. I kept cleaning, forcing myself to act normal. My skin prickled, but I moved row by row, getting closer. When I reached the last few rows, I stopped and looked up again. Still there. No reaction, no movement. The feeling in my stomach tightened. Something about this wasn't right. I could barely make out any details in the darkness, just a solid black shape. I didn't want to get any closer. The area had enough drug addicts and unstable people that I knew better than to confront someone alone. I turned, heading back down toward the lobby to grab my manager. That's when I heard it. A voice. Low, almost amused. "You forgot to clean up here." I froze. My stomach twisted, and my legs felt weak. The voice was quiet but clear, coming from that top row. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I didn't look back. I walked straight out of the theater, forcing myself not to run. My hands felt cold and clammy as I pushed through the doors and into the bright lobby. I found my manager near the concession stand. I told him someone was still in Theater 6 and wouldn't leave. I didn't mention how weird it felt. I just said someone was sitting in the dark and not responding at first. He nodded and followed me back. We walked in together, his flashlight cutting through the dim theater. I stayed behind him as he swept the beam across the seats. Empty. Every row, every seat. No one was there. I felt my stomach drop. He checked the exits. Both were locked from the outside, as they should be. There was no way anyone could have slipped out. I didn't know what to say. I knew I saw someone. I knew I heard that voice. But the theater was completely empty. My manager looked at me, annoyed but also a little skeptical. "Maybe someone snuck out when you weren't looking," he said. I didn't argue. I just nodded. But I knew what I saw. I didn't finish cleaning Theater 6 that night. My manager told me to move on to the next one. I didn't go back inside alone. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, that someone had been waiting for me to get close, and that I had left just in time. I don't know if I believed in spirits before all of this. Maybe I thought about them the way most people do, a fleeting curiosity, a chill down the spine at a strange noise in the dark, the occasional doubt creeping in when something unexplainable happened. But I never put too much thought into it, not until we moved to the farm. My father passed away in 2005, just over a year after my daughter was born. Losing him felt like losing a piece of myself. He had been my anchor, the kind of man who could fix anything, make sense of anything, and stand unshaken through any storm. When he died, it left a hole, not just in our lives but in the land itself. The farm had been his pride, his legacy. It only made sense that we moved there after he was gone. At the time, it was me, my then husband, my sister, and my baby. The house was old, but sturdy, sitting on acres of open farmland, stretching out like a quiet, endless sea of green. The walls carried the weight of years of memories of my father's presence. The creaking floors, the draft in the hallways, the way the house settled into itself at night. It all felt familiar, like coming home to something both comforting and unsettling. The first few weeks were uneventful. We were busy adjusting, unpacking, settling into a routine. The farm was quiet, peaceful. It felt like my father had never really left, and in a way, I found comfort in that. Then my ex-husband started waking me up in the middle of the night, always at the same time, always with the same words. "There's a man's voice in your sister's room." At first, I brushed it off. Half asleep, groggy, I'd wave it away with a mumble, roll over, and drift back into unconsciousness. But he kept waking me up, a few times a week. Same time, same words. I started listening, lying there in bed, barely breathing, straining my ears against the silence. And I heard it, a low, familiar murmur, coming from my sister's room. It was faint, almost like a distant radio playing on the edge of perception. But I recognized it, my father's voice. Even in my confusion, half lost between dreaming and waking, I would mumble, "It's the old man," as if that explained everything, as if it made any of this normal. I didn't question it, maybe because I didn't want to, maybe because, in some twisted way, it felt safe. My father was still here. That's what I told myself. That's what I clung to. Then came the kitchen. It was late afternoon. Sunlight streamed in through the window over the sink, turning the dust in the air to golden flecks. I was standing at the counter, peeling potatoes, preparing dinner. The rhythmic scrape of the peeler, the distant hum of the wind outside, the quiet creaks of the old house settling, mundane, ordinary sounds. Then, right behind me, so close I could feel the breath of it, his voice. Clear, strong, undeniable. "Tenile, something's wrong with your sister." The knife clattered from my hand, bouncing off the counter. My body locked, frozen in place, every nerve firing at once. The scream ripped out of me, raw and animalistic, the kind that claws its way out of your throat without permission. The house fell silent. I spun around. Nothing. No one. The air felt thick, suffocating, like the house itself was pressing in on me. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I told myself I was losing my mind. That grief was playing tricks on me. That it was stress, exhaustion, something rational. But I knew, and I wasn't the only one. My sister started talking in her sleep, loudly. Sometimes it was just a whisper, other times full conversations. I would hear her through the walls, arguing, pleading, sometimes laughing. But the scariest part was the pauses, long stretches of silence, as if she was listening to something. She had no memory of it in the mornings, no recollection of speaking at all. Then the shadows came, reflections where they shouldn't be. The edge of movement caught in mirrors, glass panes, the darkened TV screen. My father's old bedroom door would swing open on its own, and sometimes, just for a split second, I'd see him stepping out. Not a ghost, not a see-through apparition, just a solid, familiar figure, there and then gone, like he had simply walked out of the room like he always used to. I avoided telling my sister. It felt cruel, unnecessary. But the weight of it pressed on me like a growing storm, an unshakable pressure building day by day. Then one night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. We sat in the living room, just the two of us, the rest of the house quiet. I laid everything out. The voices, the shadows, the kitchen, the way our father's presence felt so unsettled. Her face changed. Not surprise, not disbelief, but something else. Something that made my stomach turn. A hesitation. A crack in the wall she had built around herself. And then she told me. She told me everything. The things she had kept quiet for months. The things she had buried so deep that even she had convinced herself they weren't real. The nights she woke up with a weight on her chest, the feeling of hands that weren't hers, the fear, the shame, the way she had pretended it wasn't happening because that was easier than acknowledging it. The assault, the violation, the horror of it. And suddenly, it all made sense. The voices, the warnings, the presence that refused to rest. Our father had known. Even from beyond, he had known. And he had done the only thing a father could do, tried to protect his child. A cold, numbing rage settled over me. The kind that doesn't burn hot, but freezes you to the core. The kind that makes you see with perfect clarity. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't religious. I wasn't superstitious. But I knew deep in my bones that my father wouldn't rest until justice was served. I told my sister we weren't staying quiet. We weren't hiding. We weren't pretending it didn't happen. It wasn't easy. It took time, courage, strength I didn't know we had. But we did it. We confronted it head on. We took back control. We made sure the person responsible would never have the chance to hurt her or anyone else again. And after that, the house was quiet. No voices in the night. No shadows in the mirrors. No footsteps from empty rooms. For the first time since we moved in, the house felt like home again. And I knew, wherever he was, my father could finally rest. I was 8 years old when my aunt and uncle had their first baby. They lived in a small house near a lake in Mexico, tucked away at the end of a narrow dirt road. Their home wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story structure with white stucco walls, a tin roof, and a front porch that faced the water. The lake itself was massive, stretching beyond the horizon, surrounded by thick trees and rolling hills. On calm days, the water was smooth like glass, but when storms rolled in, it could turn violent in an instant. It was the middle of the rainy season when my uncle called my parents, telling them about the heavy storms passing through. The rain had been coming down in sheets all night, hammering the roof and flooding the narrow roads. My aunt had told him to be careful about letting the water rise too much in the backyard because the lake tended to spill over when it rained too hard. That morning, before the sun had even started to rise, they woke up to the sound of something outside. At first, they thought it was just the storm, wind pushing against the house, water rushing through the gutters. But then they heard something else. Crying. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the rain. But it was there, mixed in with the wind, like a child sobbing somewhere out in the dark. My aunt froze, straining her ears. My uncle sat up in bed. They both knew, without even needing to say it aloud, that it wasn't their baby. The sound was coming from outside. Close. A deep, uneasy feeling settled in my aunt's stomach. My uncle had always been the type to dismiss anything he couldn't explain, but even he felt something was off. The crying was strange, unnatural in a way that was hard to describe. It didn't rise and fall like a normal child's cry. It was steady, almost rhythmic, and it didn't move. It didn't fade or get closer. It just stayed right outside the house, barely audible over the rain. That was when my uncle's chest tightened with an awful thought. Asterisk, asterisk, the baby. Asterisk, asterisk. Without hesitating, he jumped out of bed and ran straight to the nursery. The small room was just down the hall, painted pale blue, with a wooden crib against the wall. His heart pounded as he stepped inside, eyes darting to the crib. He expected to see something, maybe the window open, maybe an animal. But the room was still. The only movement came from the thin white curtain fluttering slightly from the draft. And in the crib, the baby lay perfectly still. For a split second, panic shot through my uncle's body. But then, just as he was about to reach in, the baby stirred, shifting in his sleep, breathing softly. He was fine. He hadn't made a sound all night. So what the hell was crying outside? My uncle picked the baby up, holding him close to his chest as he backed out of the nursery. The crying hadn't stopped. It still echoed through the rain, sounding like it was right outside the window. My aunt stood frozen in the bedroom doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale. Neither of them spoke. There was no need to. They both knew what they had heard. They took the baby into their room and locked the door. The crying continued for a little while longer, but by the time the sun started to rise, it was gone. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and the wind had died down. The house was silent except for the occasional drip of water from the roof. My aunt and uncle didn't talk about it. They didn't look outside. Later that morning, my uncle went to check around the house. The yard was wet and muddy, the grass flattened by the storm. He walked along the side of the house, glancing at the ground, expecting to see footprints, maybe tire tracks, something to explain what they had heard. But there was nothing. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been there. Just silence. For the rest of the day, they tried to forget about it. The baby was fine. The house was fine. Maybe it had just been the wind, or a stray animal, or some trick of the storm. But that didn't explain the feeling. The deep, gut-wrenching fear that had settled over them in those early hours. That night, my uncle made sure the baby slept in their room. The nursery door stayed shut. They never heard the crying again. But whenever it rained, my aunt always felt uneasy. Even years later, she would still wake up in the middle of the night during storms, listening for something she never wanted to hear again, even if it was far away. I was 12 the first time I noticed it. At first, it didn't seem like anything important. Just a car. A white sedan, old-looking, probably from the late 90s. I'd see it parked on the side of the road sometimes, or rolling slowly down the street like any other vehicle. Nothing unusual. Nothing that stood out. But then I started to notice it more. I lived in a quiet neighborhood. A mix of older homes and a few newer ones, with cracked sidewalks and tall oak trees stretching their roots underneath the pavement. The kind of place where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flicked on, where everyone knew each other by name, and where summers felt endless. My two best friends and I, along with a handful of other kids our age, spent most of our free time outside. We rode bikes, explored the woods behind the neighborhood, and sometimes snuck onto the golf course late at night just to mess around. It wasn't unusual for cars to pass by as we rode. Parents coming home from work, delivery trucks, the occasional stranger visiting a friend, or getting lost in the maze of suburban streets. But this car, this white sedan, was different. It didn't just pass by. It followed. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I started to pay attention. Every time we were out riding, there it was. Not parked, not turning into a driveway, just rolling along behind us slow, steady. Too slow for normal traffic. Too steady to be a coincidence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone visiting a friend. Maybe an old person who drove slow. Maybe a parent waiting to pick up their kid. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I remember one particular evening in late summer, when the sun was hanging low, bleeding orange through the trees. My friends and I had just finished riding down one of the longer streets in the neighborhood, a wide stretch that led to a cul-de-sac. We'd done it 100 times before, raced down the hill, coasted to the bottom, then turned around and did it again. But that day, as we turned back, I saw it. The sedan. It was at the far end of the street, barely creeping forward. No turn signals. No movement inside that I could make out. Just rolling, slow and steady. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. We turned onto a side street, and a minute later, I glanced back. It had turned too. Another turn. It followed. Another. Still there. The pit in my stomach grew heavier with each block we passed. The feeling wasn't like the normal childhood fears I was used to. It wasn't like being afraid of the dark or jumping at a scary movie. It was a deeper kind of fear. Something instinctual. Something that made my chest tighten, made my body feel small and exposed, made my brain scream at me to go home. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My best friend was riding beside me, and when I caught his eye, I saw that he'd already been looking over his shoulder too. The others must have felt it as well, because without saying a word, we all started riding faster. We cut through a yard, hopped a curb, and pedaled hard toward my friend's house. By the time we reached his driveway, my lungs were burning. My heart pounded against my ribs as we dumped our bikes onto the grass and scrambled onto his porch, peering out from behind the railing. The sedan rolled past. It didn't stop, didn't slow down, just kept moving at that same, steady crawl, gliding past the house like it wasn't looking for anything. But we knew better. That was the first time we really, truly knew we were being followed. After that, we kept track. We started looking for it on purpose, keeping our eyes peeled every time we went out. And sure enough, it was always there. Some days it would appear early, trailing us from the moment we left someone's driveway. Other times it would show up later, like it had been waiting, watching from somewhere unseen before deciding to creep forward. No matter what, it never stopped, never pulled into a house, never drove away when we noticed it. It just followed. For weeks, we tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was someone's older sibling messing with us. Maybe it was some weird guy who lived in the neighborhood and just had nothing better to do. Maybe it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing, because every time we saw it, that feeling returned. That slow, creeping dread. That instinctual, full-body alertness that made the air feel wrong. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like we were being hunted. And then, one day, my friend saw the license plate. It was by accident. We were riding near the main road when we spotted the sedan waiting at a stop sign. My friend, who had been the most determined to get answers, slowed down just enough to glance at the plate. He repeated the numbers under his breath, over and over, until we got back to his house where he could write them down. That night, his parents called the police. At first, I didn't think they'd take it seriously. We were just kids. No real proof of anything. Just a weird car following us around. But when the cops ran the plate, their expressions changed. It didn't match the car. I don't know exactly what happened after that. The police took our statements, asked us questions, and then left. For a while, the sedan stopped showing up. We went back to our normal summer routines, riding, exploring, staying out late until our parents called us in. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. And then one night, just as the school year was about to start, I saw it again. I was alone this time, walking home from a friend's house just a few streets away. It was dark, the streetlights humming above me, my footsteps quiet against the pavement. I wasn't scared. I had walked this route 100 times before. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. A car, white, rolling down the street. Slow, steady. I froze. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But then the headlights flicked off. I turned, started walking faster. My house was only 2 blocks away. I could make it. Just keep moving. I could hear the car now. The soft hum of the tires against the road. Not stopping, not turning, just following. I felt my breath catch. My legs stiffened, urging me to run, but I didn't. I didn't want to make it obvious that I knew. I didn't want to give them a reason to act. I turned the last corner, my house finally in sight. The porch light was on. I could hear the faint sound of my dad's TV through the window. I ran. I ran up the steps, yanked open the door, slammed it shut behind me. By the time I turned back to the window, the sedan was gone. I never saw it again. But to this day, I wonder about it. Who they were, what they wanted, and if somewhere they're still out there, watching, waiting, for someone else. The first time we saved our family, I was barely old enough to remember it. The second time, I was old enough to understand what almost happened. But both times, it was nothing but luck and tiny, almost insignificant moments that made the difference between everything being fine and everything going horribly wrong. It's strange to look back on those trips now, realizing how close we came to disaster without even knowing it. At the time, I thought of them as just long, boring car rides to Florida. I didn't know how fast things could change. I didn't know how thin the line was between a normal vacation and never making it there at all. But I know now. It was supposed to be a normal road trip to Florida, the kind my family made every year. My grandparents lived down there, so we packed up the car, loaded in all our stuff, and started the long drive from home. I don't remember much from the first part of the trip, just flashes of highway, gas stations, and my parents switching off driving. My sister was barely 2 years old, still in a car seat, and she had been quiet most of the way. She was normally fussy on long drives, but for some reason, this time she wasn't. She just sat there, either asleep or watching the road with wide, blank eyes. We drove for hours, crossing state lines, stopping only when we needed gas or food. I remember how heavy the air felt when we got further south, like it was pressing down on us. It was warm, humid, and sticky even inside the car. Then the sky changed. It happened slowly at first, so slow that I didn't notice. But at some point, the bright blue of the afternoon disappeared. It was replaced with this thick, sickly green color, a shade I had never seen before. It wasn't the deep, dark gray of a thunderstorm or the black of night. It was something else, something unnatural. Even as a kid, I knew that color meant something bad. I didn't know why, but I knew. It made my stomach feel tight and wrong. The wind picked up. Trees bent at strange angles on the side of the road. The car rocked slightly when a gust hit us. But on the radio, there was nothing. No weather warnings, no sirens, nothing about tornadoes. Just music and static. My parents kept driving. Then, out of nowhere, my sister started screaming. Not crying, not whining, screaming. It was the kind of sound that cut through everything else. Piercing, desperate. She had been completely fine the whole trip, and suddenly, she was shrieking her lungs out. My parents tried to calm her down, but nothing worked. She just kept screaming. She was kicking, thrashing against her car seat, wailing like she was in pain. And the only thing she was saying was, "Food, food, food." My mom and dad tried to ignore it at first, thinking she would stop, but she didn't. It got worse, louder. It filled the whole car. My dad clenched the steering wheel. My mom turned around trying to shush her, but my sister wouldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like forever, my dad caved. "Fine," he muttered, pulling off at the next exit. We stopped at some small roadside diner, the kind with faded yellow lights and peeling paint on the sign. My mom took my sister inside, still screaming, and my dad leaned his head against the steering wheel with a deep sigh. The whole stop lasted maybe 45 minutes, an hour at most. Eventually, my sister calmed down. We got back in the car and kept driving. An hour later, we saw it. One of the main roads we were supposed to take was completely gone. Not damaged, gone. The pavement was ripped up in huge, jagged chunks. Power lines were down, tangled in trees that had been snapped like matchsticks. There were pieces of buildings scattered across the ground, like someone had taken a giant hand and crushed them. A tornado had torn through. I don't remember what my parents said when they saw it. I don't remember their faces, but I remember the silence. I didn't understand how close we had been. I didn't understand that if my sister hadn't started screaming when she did, we might have been right there when it happened. We might have been in the car when the wind hit, when the world started ripping apart. We might not have made it, but we kept driving, and we never talked about it again. I was older the second time it happened, old enough to sit in the front seat, old enough to remember every detail. We were driving through Georgia, heading south again. The rain had been coming down hard for most of the drive, hammering the windshield so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. But eventually it let up. The storm moved on, leaving behind slick roads and puddles that stretched across lanes. I was staring out the window, not really thinking about anything, just watching the wet road blur past. Then I saw it. A car, flying down an on-ramp to the highway. Fast. Way too fast. It was a sports car, low to the ground, sleek, the kind that looked like it belonged on a racetrack, not a wet road. It hit a massive puddle at the bottom of the ramp, and I knew what was about to happen. I didn't scream. I didn't shout. I just sucked in a sharp, tiny breath. It was barely a sound, but my dad heard it. He glanced in my direction, followed my gaze, and saw the car. In less than a second, he reacted. He slowed down and veered slightly to the left. Not a huge movement, just enough. And then, the car hit the water. It didn't just skid. It spun. At 60 miles an hour, it lost control completely, sliding across all the lanes in front of us. The tires caught for a second, and then the whole car flipped. It rolled straight into the median, metal crunching, glass shattering. For a second, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared. If my dad hadn't slowed down when he did, if he had been even a second later reacting, that car would have hit us. Full speed. Directly in our lane. We would have been right there when it spun out of control. I don't know what happened to the driver. I don't know if they were okay. All I know is that we kept driving. My dad didn't say anything, and I didn't either. But my heart didn't stop pounding for a long time. I think about those moments sometimes. How small they were. A screaming toddler in the back seat. A tiny gasp in the front. Little things that didn't seem like much, but somehow changed everything. It's terrifying, really. How close we came to not making it. How many times things almost went the other way. And how sometimes you don't even realize what just happened. How close you were, until long after it's over. It happened when I was 11. I was a restless kid, always struggling with sleep. My parents tried everything, earlier bedtimes, no sugar after dinner, even taking away my night light at one point, but none of it worked. I just wasn't tired when I was supposed to be. Most nights, I would sit in my room, lost in my own world, drawing or reading, waiting for sleep to find me. That night was no different. I was sitting at my desk, sketching in my notebook, the glow of my small desk lamp the only light in my room. It cast a soft yellow circle over my paper, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. My room was small, just enough space for my bed, a dresser, and my desk. The door was directly in front of where I was sitting, slightly open, revealing the hallway outside. The hallway in our house was long. Too long. It stretched from one end of the house to the other, with no windows, no source of natural light. During the day, it was just a hallway, nothing special. But at night, when all the lights were off, it became something else entirely. A black void. Even though I knew every inch of it, I hated looking at it in the dark. That night, I was sitting in my chair, my pencil scratching against the paper, lost in whatever I was drawing. I don't even remember what it was, maybe a cartoon character, maybe some random shapes. But at some point, I shifted in my seat, stretching my back, and I turned toward the door. That's when I saw it. There was something in the hallway. It stood just outside my room, barely visible in the darkness. It was small, maybe the height of an 8 or 9-year-old child. I thought for a second that it was my little cousin, though that didn't make any sense. He didn't live with us. No other kids were in the house. Then, I saw the thing it was standing on. A long red bag. I froze. My first thought was that my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe it was something left in the hallway that just looked like a person. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked away, then looked back. It was still there. I remember this overwhelming feeling of wrongness settling over me. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just stared, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move either. It didn't sway or shift like a person should. It just stood there. Something about the way it was positioned made my skin crawl. It wasn't natural. It didn't make sense. My mind raced, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? Something my parents had left in the hallway? But why would there be a red bag there? And what was standing on it? I didn't want to keep looking, but I was too scared to turn away. My hands felt clammy, my legs locked in place under my desk. I felt like if I moved, even the slightest twitch, something terrible would happen. I don't know what. I just knew I couldn't move. Then, a thought crossed my mind, one that made my stomach twist into a knot. What if this isn't just my imagination? I squeezed my eyes shut, told myself to stop being stupid. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Just some random object my brain was misinterpreting in the dark. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I turned back to my drawing, forced myself to focus on the paper, on the lines, on the tiny details of whatever I had been sketching. My fingers were shaking. I pressed the pencil against the page so hard it almost snapped. I listened. Silence. Just my own breathing. My heartbeat. The soft scratch of my pencil. Then footsteps. Farther down the hallway. Slow. Measured. I didn't dare look. The steps weren't coming toward me. They were just there, echoing softly from somewhere deep in the house. I swallowed, my throat dry. My hands were slick with sweat. My whole body felt locked in place, as if moving would break whatever thin thread of safety I had left. And then, after what felt like forever, I heard another sound. A door opening, then another set of footsteps, lighter, faster. My mother. She was awake. Relief washed over me so fast I almost cried. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I heard her coming down the hallway, her footsteps growing louder, more familiar. She stopped outside my door. I knew she was going to be mad. She hated finding me awake this late. I braced myself for it, still too afraid to turn around. She stepped inside my room. I forced myself to glance at the doorway. The hallway was empty. The red bag was gone. There was nothing there. No figure. No shape. Just darkness stretching down the hallway, the same way it always had. I swallowed hard, my chest still tight with leftover fear. My mom didn't notice anything was wrong. She just scolded me for being up so late, told me to go to bed, then left. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I turned off my desk lamp and crawled into bed. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had seen. I never saw anything like it again. Never heard those strange footsteps at night, but I never forgot it either. And to this day, I still have no idea what it was. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. No work, no traffic, no constant notifications from my phone. Just me, the open air, and the dense forest stretching for miles around. I had driven out to a remote camping spot about 4 hours from home, a place I had visited once before, but never alone. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing off an old logging road, surrounded by nothing but thick trees and the distant sound of running water from a nearby creek. The spot was perfect. No crowds, no light pollution, and no cell service. Just me and nature. I arrived in the early afternoon, set up my tent near the tree line, and collected enough firewood to last the night. The sun hung low by the time I got everything settled, its golden light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I took a moment to breathe it all in. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt good. The tension in my shoulders eased, the weight of daily life peeling away as I listened to the quiet hum of the forest. Then, just as I was about to start a fire, I saw something, or someone, moving along the ridge of a hill about 200 feet away. A dark figure, walking in a straight line, silhouetted against the dimming sky. They didn't stop, didn't look my way. Just moved steadily across the ridge until they disappeared over the other side. It unsettled me. This place was remote. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. I hadn't seen another car on the dirt road leading in. No signs of campers or hikers. My first thought was that it could be a hunter, maybe just passing through. But something about the way they moved, that steady, unbroken pace, made my stomach tighten. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty ridge. Then, convincing myself it was nothing, I turned back to my fire. Night came fast in the woods. The air cooled, the sky darkened to an endless black, the stars sharp and bright overhead. The fire crackled softly, sending flickering light over my small campsite. I cooked a quick meal, ate in silence, and let the warmth of the fire sink into my skin. But that unease from earlier never fully went away. I kept glancing toward the ridge, half expecting to see that figure again. Nothing, just the trees shifting in the breeze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I forced myself to relax. I threw another log on the fire, stretched out my legs, and stared up at the sky. The night was calm, peaceful even. If someone else was out here, they were probably just passing through. By midnight, I was tired. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest had settled into quiet stillness. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there, listening to the night. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was awake again. Eyes open, heart pounding. Something had woken me. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent, I heard it, soft but unmistakable. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. It was close. My chest tightened. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Someone was just outside. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Slow, measured inhales and exhales, the kind you only hear when someone is deliberately trying to stay quiet. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it faded. A few soft crunches of footsteps, and then nothing. I didn't move. I lay there, pulse hammering in my ears, waiting for something else. Minutes passed. The forest stayed silent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached for the knife I kept beside me, gripping it tight. My other hand went to the flashlight. I wanted to check, to make sure no one was there, but part of me didn't want to know. After a long while, I forced myself to sit up. My fingers fumbled for the zipper of the tent. I hesitated, took a deep breath, then slowly unzipped it just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire had died down to a faint glow. The trees stood motionless in the darkness. I waited, listening. No movement. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that maybe it was just the wind shifting the trees in a way that sounded like breathing. I didn't fully believe it, but I forced myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Morning came slow. The first rays of sunlight barely warmed the cold ground as I crawled out of my tent, body stiff from barely sleeping. The fire had completely died, leaving only ashes and charred wood. Then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, Unmistakable footprints in the dirt, circling my campsite. My stomach dropped. They weren't mine. I had only worn boots, and these were different, smaller, like someone barefoot or wearing thin-soled shoes. They led from the trees to my tent, pausing just outside before looping around the fire pit and vanishing back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. Someone had been here, standing just feet from me while I slept. That sick, twisting feeling in my gut came back full force. I had to get out of here. I packed fast, threw my gear into my bag, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and didn't waste time double-checking. The whole time, I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see someone watching. The footprints didn't go toward the ridge where I had seen the figure the night before. They led deeper into the forest. I didn't want to know where they went. As soon as everything was packed, I grabbed my knife, kept it in my hand, and started toward my car. The forest was too quiet. My ears strained for any sound, footsteps, rustling, breathing. But there was nothing. When I reached my car, I threw my bag inside, yanked open the door, and locked it behind me before starting the engine. I looked up at the ridge one last time, and there they were, a figure standing at the top, not moving, just watching. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow road, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? No crime was committed. No real evidence of anything but footprints in the dirt. But I knew what I saw. I knew someone was out there that night. And the worst part, I don't think they were just passing through. I think they were waiting. And if I had stepped out of my tent just a little earlier, if I had checked the fire while they were still there, I don't know what would have happened. I don't want to know. I was in my second year of college when I lived in a shared house with 5 other students. We were all from different backgrounds, different majors, and different friend groups, but over time, we became close in that way roommates do, sharing the occasional late-night conversation in the kitchen, borrowing each other's stuff without asking, and making enough memories together that, even though we weren't best friends, we still felt like some kind of disjointed family. Spring break came, and everyone scattered. Some people went home, some went on road trips, and some, like my housemate Liz, went big. She and a few of her friends booked a trip to Panama for the week, choosing a beach resort known for wild nightlife, cheap drinks, and everything else that made a spring break trip worth it. I stayed behind, partially because I couldn't afford a trip like that, and partially because, if I was being honest, the idea of an overcrowded beach full of drunk college kids didn't sound fun. But I wasn't the type to judge. It was their kind of fun, and I hoped they'd have a good time. When Liz came back, I barely saw her for the first day. She was exhausted from the trip and mostly stayed in her room. But when I finally did see her, I also noticed something else. Her friend, Emma, who had gone with her, was back too. And she didn't look good. Emma wasn't my friend, but I knew her from parties and through mutual connections. Normally, she was put together, pretty, stylish, and always carrying herself with confidence. But when I saw her after the trip, she looked rough. Her skin was pale, her eyes dull, and the most noticeable thing? The sores on her mouth. They were bad. Not just little cold sores, but large, inflamed blisters, red and cracked at the edges. It was the kind of thing you didn't want to stare at, but couldn't help noticing. I felt a little bad for her. I didn't know much about cold sores, but I figured it was something a doctor could fix. A few days passed, and I finally got around to asking Liz about the trip. She gave me the usual rundown: partying, drinking, meeting new people, the kind of surface-level recap you'd expect. But then she told me about the guy. Apparently, Emma had caught the attention of some guy from Panama while they were on the beach. He was persistent, constantly trying to get her attention, following them around, finding excuses to talk to her. At first, they laughed it off. He was charming, and Emma had a flirty personality to begin with, so it was all fun and games at first. But he didn't go away. Every time they went out, he was there. He started showing up at their resort, acting like it was a coincidence. Each time, he asked Emma to come home with him. She always said no, sticking to the typical safety rules of traveling. Don't go off alone with a stranger, especially in a foreign country. But on the second to last night, she gave in. Instead of going to his place, she let him come up to her room. It was supposed to be safer, she had her friends nearby, and it wasn't like she was the first person to hook up on vacation. The next day, he gave her his number and told her if she trusted him now, she should spend her last night at his place. She didn't, and thank God for that. When they got back to campus, Emma wasn't feeling great. She was itchy, uncomfortable, and obviously concerned. The sores on her mouth had worsened, spreading, getting more painful. She went to the campus clinic, bringing Liz along for support. That's when things took a turn. The doctor who examined her was shocked. He told her he had never seen this before in real life, only in medical literature. He asked if she had kissed any locals or had any contact with them. She admitted that she had. That's when he told her what was wrong. She had contracted a rare form of necrosis. Her skin wasn't just irritated, it was literally dying. The condition was so rare that it was almost unheard of outside of very specific cases. And those cases, they were mostly seen in necrophiliacs, people who had sexual contact with dead bodies. She was horrified. Liz was horrified. Even the doctor seemed disturbed. He asked her where she had been, who she had been with, and told her that she needed to go to the authorities immediately. Emma was terrified, but she did as she was told. The case dragged on for over a year, but in the end, they found him. The man she had been with wasn't just some guy flirting with tourists. He was a predator. When the police finally caught him, they searched his home. That's where they found the bodies. Multiple missing women, tourists who had disappeared over the years. He had been keeping them. He had been doing things to them. And Emma had nearly become one of them. I don't know what happened to her after that. She transferred schools not long after, and Liz eventually moved out of our house. We all went our separate ways, and time moved on. But every now and then, I think about her. I think about how close she came to something unimaginable. I think about how, if she had just said yes to his invitation that last night, she might have never made it back. And most of all, I think about the way we talk about danger. We warn people about thieves, about muggers, about drinking too much and getting lost. But we don't think about the monsters hiding in plain sight, the ones who smile, flirt, and seem just like everyone else. Until it's too late. Moving into a new house should have been exciting, but something about my room felt off from the beginning. I couldn't explain it, just a weird, uneasy feeling whenever I was alone in there. The house itself wasn't that old, maybe a few decades at most. It wasn't falling apart or anything, and nothing bad had happened in it, at least not that I knew of. It was just a normal house in a normal neighborhood. But my room? It never felt right. My little sister's room was right next to mine. We were both young, and my parents had let us sleep on mattresses on the floor since we hadn't moved in our beds yet. It was temporary, just until they finished setting up the furniture. At first, it was fun, like camping indoors. My sister and I would stay up late, whispering, playing with flashlights, and sneaking out for water when we were supposed to be sleeping. We finally got tired around 10 at night, and I remember lying there in the dark, trying to fall asleep. That's when it started. It took me a long time to drift off. I never slept with my glasses on, so everything was blurry in the dark, just vague shapes and shadows. The ceiling, the walls, the edges of the room, all of it was hazy, but I could still make out the general layout. I was just starting to feel sleepy when I heard something. A voice. It wasn't loud or clear at first, just distant. But it got stronger, more familiar. I heard my name. My parents were calling me. At least, I thought they were. I stayed still listening. The voices repeated my name, over and over again, as if they were calling me from another room. I couldn't tell exactly where they were coming from. My door was closed, but the sound wasn't muffled like it should have been. It was as if the voices were coming from inside my room. I blinked, trying to focus. The voices were my parents, but something was wrong. They sounded flat, hollow, like a bad recording, like someone playing their voices through a broken speaker. The words repeated in the same tone every time, never changing. I squeezed my eyes shut. It's not real. I told myself that over and over. It wasn't real. I knew that, but my brain wouldn't let go of it. The sound drilled into my head, like it was trying to force me to believe it was real. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. A thick, heavy silence that felt unnatural, as if the whole house had gone dead. No creaking, no distant cars, no wind against the windows. Just nothing. I exhaled, feeling my heartbeat slow down. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just so tired that my brain made it up. That had to be it. But then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The dark already made things hard to see, and without my glasses, everything was blurry. but I could still tell when something was there. Something was there. It was standing in the corner of my room, near the wall. A shape, tall, thin, unmoving. It was just standing there, watching me. I stared at it, waiting for my eyes to adjust, hoping I'd realize it was just a shadow or some piece of furniture I had forgotten about. But as I focused, it didn't fade or disappear. It became clearer. I wanted to turn away, to ignore it, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my body locked in place. It wasn't fear that kept me still. It was something else, something heavier, like my body refused to move. Then, more of them appeared. I don't know how many. At first, 2, then 3, then more. They weren't moving, weren't making any noise. Just standing there, staring at me. I tried to breathe, but my chest felt tight. My arms, my legs, everything was heavy. I tried to turn, to pull my blanket over my head, to close my eyes and shut them out. But I couldn't. I could barely even blink. I was stuck. Sleep paralysis. I'd had it before, but never like this. I tried to remind myself that it wasn't real, that it was just my brain messing with me, that I was half asleep and dreaming, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. The figures were there. I could see them. Even though my vision was blurry, I could tell they were watching me. I couldn't tell if they had eyes. Their faces were too vague, too shadowed, but I felt them looking at me. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, for my sister, for anyone, but my lips wouldn't move. My throat was locked. All I could do was lie there, frozen, while they stared at me. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes, hours, it felt endless. The only thing I could do was close my eyes. I focused all my energy on that, forcing my eyelids shut, blocking them out. If I couldn't see them, maybe they'd go away. Eventually, I slipped into unconsciousness. When I woke up, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining through my window. The weird heaviness in my chest was gone. I could move. I sat up slowly, looking around my room. There was nothing there. No shapes, no shadows, no figures. Just my plain, empty room. I exhaled, trying to shake off the feeling. Just sleep paralysis. That's all it was. A hallucination. My brain playing tricks on me. But then my parents told me what happened. At some point during the night, they had heard me talking in my sleep. Go away. Mother, why are you calling me? Hello. I didn't remember saying any of that. I had no memory of speaking at all. It creeped me out, but I tried to brush it off. I had always talked in my sleep, after all. Maybe my brain was just reacting to the paralysis, trying to wake me up. Maybe it was just another trick of the mind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in my room that night, watching me. I still don't know how close I came to dying. That's what keeps me up some nights, the not knowing. The feeling that I was seconds, minutes, hours away from something I can't even comprehend. Something that doesn't fit into the world I used to believe in. When I studied abroad in Moscow, I was young, excited, and naive in ways I didn't even realize. It was my first time living outside my home country, my first real taste of independence. I was ready for adventure, and Moscow was an adventure. The city was massive, cold, and full of history. I fell in love with its endless energy, the constant movement of people in the streets, the golden domes of churches catching the sunlight, the long nights that blurred into mornings. It felt like anything could happen. And for a while, it felt like I was invincible. And then there was him. I met Dmitri. At least, that's the name he gave me, about 2 months into my stay. He wasn't a student. He wasn't one of the guys from my program, or some clueless American like me fumbling through Russian. He was local, a few years older than me. Smart, confident, quiet in a way that made me want to lean in closer, listen harder. He was good-looking, but not in an obvious way. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, always dressed well, always carrying himself like he was in control of every situation. There was something about him that pulled me in. I liked that he spoke to me in Russian, never slowing down, never dumbing things down for me. He made me feel like I belonged, like I wasn't just another foreigner passing through. With him, I felt like I was part of something real. We spent most of our time at his apartment, a place that was somehow both modern and sparse, clean but impersonal. There weren't many decorations, no family photos, nothing that made it feel like a home. But I ignored that. I ignored the way he never talked about his past, how he always steered the conversation away from himself. I ignored the fact that I had never met a single one of his friends. I ignored a lot of things. On my last night in Moscow, we planned to spend the whole evening together. I was supposed to fly out the next morning, and I wanted it to be special. Just the two of us. He cooked dinner for me. Something with lamb, rich and fragrant. A meal that made my stomach feel warm and heavy. He poured me a glass of wine, then another. His fingers brushed against my skin when he refilled my glass, and I felt his warmth even before he touched me. I remember feeling safe. That's the part that makes me sick now. At some point in the evening, my phone started buzzing. I ignored it the first few times, caught up in the moment, not wanting to be pulled away. But then the calls kept coming. I finally glanced at my screen and saw it was Anna, one of the girls from my program. She had been out drinking with some people, and things had gotten out of control. She was lost, drunk, and panicked somewhere in the city. She needed help. I hesitated. I didn't want to leave. But something about her voice, slurred but desperate, made my stomach twist. Dmitri watched me as I listened to her. His expression didn't change. He just stared at me, waiting. "I have to go," I said, feeling guilty, feeling like I was ruining our night. He didn't try to stop me, didn't argue. He just stood up and walked to the kitchen. When he came back, he had a small bottle in his hand. "For your back," he said, unscrewing the lid. "A massage before you leave." It smelled strong, herbal oily. I didn't think twice about it. I let him rub it into my skin, his hands firm but gentle. It felt nice, warm, comforting. I thanked him, kissed him, and then left. Anna was a mess when I found her, barely able to stand, crying and laughing at the same time. It took an hour to get her back to her dorm, another hour to make sure she was okay before I left. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I collapsed onto my bed, too tired to even shower. When I woke up, my back was burning. At first, I thought I had just slept weird, that my skin was sensitive from the massage oil. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw red, swollen blotches spreading across my skin. It looked like an allergic reaction, raw and irritated. I felt off, not just from the rash, but in a way I couldn't explain. Like something was wrong and I didn't know what. I had a flight to catch, but I decided to go to a doctor first. It wasn't easy finding one last minute, but I managed. The doctor examined me, asked questions about what I had put on my skin. I told him about the oil, how a friend had given me a massage with it. He ran some tests, said he would call me in a few days with results. I left, caught my flight, and tried to push it all out of my mind. I had barely been home for a day when my phone rang. The doctor from Moscow. His voice was tense, urgent. He told me I needed to come back immediately. I explained I was in another country now, thousands of miles away. Then he told me what they found. The rash wasn't from an allergic reaction. It was from a chemical compound used in meat tenderizer. Something that breaks down tissue, softens muscle fibers. Something that prepares meat for consumption. My stomach dropped. My hands went numb. I felt like I was floating outside my own body. Dmitri had rubbed that into my skin. I thought back to the dinner he made, the way the lamb had tasted, the way he had watched me eat. I thought about how calm he had been when I left, how he hadn't protested, hadn't tried to stop me, because he had already started. I never heard from him again. I never found out his real name. But a few months later, I read about a man arrested in Moscow. A man who had been drugging, killing, and eating women. The police believed he had been doing it for years. I stared at his picture for a long time. His face was thinner, his hair shorter, but it was him. It was Dmitri, and he had been preparing me. If Anna hadn't called me that night, if I hadn't left, I don't finish that thought. I don't let myself. I'm safe now. I tell myself that over and over. I'm safe. But at night, when I wake up sweating, my back still tingling where he touched me, I know I will never, ever feel safe again. I don't usually nap in the evening. Something about the grogginess afterward, the way my body feels heavier than it should, like I'm waking up in pieces instead of all at once. It throws me off. But that day, exhaustion had gotten the best of me. Maybe it was the long hours, the bad sleep the night before, or just the weight of everything piling up. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, only to rest my eyes for a moment. But when I opened them again, the room was dimmer, shadows stretched long against the walls. Dusk had settled in. I could feel it immediately. The weight, the wrongness. I knew before I even tried to move that I wouldn't be able to. It wasn't the usual sluggishness of waking up too fast. not the clumsy disorientation of a deep sleep. It was something else entirely. My body was locked, frozen under an unseen force, held down like someone had pressed me between two solid slabs of stone. My arms, my legs, my chest, it all felt useless. The harder I tried to move, the more impossible it became. I'd been through this before. Sleep paralysis. I knew what it was, could explain the science behind it, had read about how the body lags behind the mind when waking from REM sleep, trapping you in a half-aware state where hallucinations can bleed into reality. I understood it, but knowing the logic of something doesn't make it less terrifying when you're living it. My breathing felt wrong, too shallow, too uneven, like something was pressing down on my ribs, crushing the air out of me. Panic set in fast. My heart slammed against my chest, each beat a violent thud. I couldn't even gulp in a breath to steady myself. It was like my lungs were locked, ribs held in place, unable to expand. My throat felt tight, raw, strangled by some unseen force. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a dark mass against the dim light filtering through the blinds. My vision felt like it was swimming, unfocused, like my brain couldn't decide if I was really seeing it or if it was some strange trick of the fading daylight. But then it moved. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the air, so deep I could feel it in my bones. A shape solidified on my chest, heavy, hunched, predatory. It was a cat, but not the kind you'd find curled up on a windowsill or purring at your feet. This thing was monstrous. Its fur was thick, matted, bristling in uneven clumps along its muscular shoulders. Its body was too large, stretched and exaggerated, like something that had started as a normal animal and twisted into something else. Its eyes locked onto mine, huge, glowing, narrowed into slits of violent, untamed fury. Then it bared its teeth. Its mouth peeled back, revealing massive fangs, long and curved, glistening with thick, slimy drool that dripped down in slow, heavy strands. The growling deepened, a sound that vibrated in my skull, rattling through me like a threat. It was pure aggression, the kind of sound an animal makes when it's about to lunge, when it's done warning and is ready to strike. I tried to scream, tried to move, tried to do anything, but my body wouldn't obey. The paralysis held me down like I was buried under concrete, helpless beneath the weight of the creature perched on my chest. Then I felt it. The claws. They weren't just resting on me anymore. They were digging in. The pressure started as a sharp sting, but then it got worse, so much worse. I felt the tips of its claws sink through my skin, pushing deeper, cutting through flesh, grinding against bone. The pain was unbearable, electric, sending fiery jolts up my ribs and into my skull. My heart pounded harder, so hard it felt like it might tear itself apart trying to escape my chest. I couldn't breathe. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, deafening, drowning out everything but the low, rumbling snarl above me. The cat leaned in closer, its fangs so near my face that I could see the thick strands of saliva stretching between them. I could smell its breath, hot, rancid, filled with the scent of raw meat and something worse, something rotting. My lungs screamed for air, but nothing came. The world started going dark at the edges. I thought, this is it. This is how I die. Then suddenly, I could move. It was like breaking the surface after drowning. 1 second, I was frozen in place, trapped beneath that horrible, snarling beast, and the next I gasped, my body lurching as if I'd been kicked back into myself. Air rushed into my lungs so fast it hurt, my chest expanding like it had been caved in and was finally released. The weight was gone. No snarling, no claws, no piercing, bone-deep pain. I could move my hands, my legs, I was free. And then I saw it. Sitting on my chest, blinking at me with wide, innocent blue eyes, was my cat. A small, fluffy, long-haired ragdoll. She was staring at me like nothing had happened, her tiny paws delicately perched on my ribs. I felt my pulse hammering against my skin, my whole body still shaking with leftover terror, and she just stood there, perfectly calm, as if she hadn't just been something else, something monstrous, something that had nearly ripped me apart. I exhaled, my breath shaking as I reached up with trembling fingers and gently lifted her off me, setting her down beside me on the bed. For a long time, I just lay there, my chest rising and falling in deep, unsteady gulps, waiting for my heart to stop slamming against my ribs. My body felt drained, weak, like I'd just run for miles with no end in sight. It had only been a dream. That's what I told myself. That's what it always was. A hallucination, a trick of the mind, the usual sleep paralysis experience warping reality into something terrifying. But even as I sat up, shaking the stiffness from my limbs. I couldn't shake the feeling of those claws. The ghost of that pain lingered in my chest, deep and aching, long after the dream had ended. Freshman year was supposed to be exciting. A new place, new people, freedom, everything we had been looking forward to. But that night in my friend's dorm room changed how I saw that building forever. It started like any other evening. There were 4 of us, just hanging out in Dana's room. The dorms weren't anything special, just the standard cinder block walls, mismatched furniture, and that faint smell of old carpet and industrial cleaning products that never really went away. Dana's room was on the 3rd floor, facing the courtyard, and she had the usual setup: 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls, a couple of cheap wooden desks, and a small fridge with a microwave on top. She had decorated the walls with some band posters and fairy lights, trying to make it feel more like home, but nothing could fully mask the institutional feel of the place. I was sitting on the bed, leaning back against the cold wall, while Dana sat cross-legged on the floor near her desk. Our other 2 friends, Jess and Mark, were sprawled out, one on the other bed and one in the desk chair. We had been talking about nothing important, just the kind of pointless, rambling conversations you have late at night when no one really wants to go to sleep yet. Then my phone rang. I remember the sound cutting through our conversation sharply, making me jump a little. It wasn't a notification or a random buzz. It was my ringtone, loud and clear. I reached for my phone, barely thinking about it, but when I saw the screen, I stopped cold. Dana calling. I blinked at it, confused. That didn't make any sense. Dana was sitting right there in front of me. I looked up at her, half expecting her to be messing with me somehow, but she wasn't even holding her phone. I held up my screen so everyone could see. Dana's face shifted from confusion to something else, something closer to discomfort. She glanced over at her purse, which was sitting on the windowsill right below the hot water pipe that ran near the ceiling. "My phone's in my bag," she said, almost too quickly, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. The room went silent. I don't know why, but a weird, prickling feeling crept up my spine. My phone was still ringing. The name was still there. I hesitated for a second before swiping to answer. No sound. Nothing at all. "Hello," I said, even though I already knew no one would respond. Still nothing. Just dead air. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. The call was still active. I put it back to my ear, straining to hear anything, breathing, static, anything, but there was nothing. Eventually, I hung up. We all just sat there, staring at each other. Dana, looking more uneasy by the second, got up, crossed the room, and grabbed her purse. She pulled out her phone, held it up so we could all see the screen. It was dark. The battery had died. That should have been the end of it. A glitch. A random, explainable thing. But none of us could shake the feeling that it wasn't. After a while, we went back to talking, forcing ourselves to laugh it off, but the mood had shifted. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting it to ring again, but it didn't. A few weeks later, we forgot about it. Then, near the end of the year, someone brought it up again. We were sitting in the dining hall when another student, someone who had been at the school a little longer, overheard us talking about that night. "You know what happened in that room, right?" they said. We didn't. Apparently, a few years before, a freshman had killed himself in Dana's room. He had hung himself from the hot water pipe, the same one right above the windowsill where Dana's purse had been that night. I don't remember much about the rest of that conversation. I just remember how everything suddenly clicked into place. The room, the pipe, the feeling we had that night. Coincidence? Maybe. But I never went back into that room alone again. The night of February 20th, 2003, is forever etched into my memory, a haunting reminder of how swiftly joy can turn into unimaginable horror. I had arrived at the Station nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island, eager to see the band Great White perform. The venue was packed beyond its 300-person capacity, with over 400 enthusiastic fans crammed inside. The air buzzed with anticipation, drinks flowed, and conversations melded into a cacophony of excitement. As the lights dimmed and the band took the stage, the crowd erupted into cheers. The opening chords resonated through the room, and suddenly, pyrotechnics flared behind the band, a dazzling display of sparks shooting upward. At first, it seemed like a thrilling addition to the show, but within seconds, I noticed flames licking up the walls. The pyrotechnics had ignited the soundproofing foam, and the fire spread with terrifying speed. Panic set in as thick, black smoke filled the room. The once jubilant crowd became a frantic mob, all pushing and shoving toward the main exit. I was caught in the surge, barely able to move, as bodies pressed against me from all sides. The heat intensified, and the acrid smell of burning materials stung my lungs. In the chaos, I was knocked off my feet and became entangled in a pile of people near the front entrance. I was trapped, pinned under the weight of others who were equally desperate to escape. The screams around me were deafening. Pleas for help, cries of pain, and the gut-wrenching wails of those realizing they might not make it out. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, the heat becoming unbearable. I could hear the building collapsing, the crackling of flames consuming everything in their path. The screams began to dwindle, one by one, until there was an eerie silence punctuated only by the sounds of the raging fire. I was overwhelmed with despair, convinced that I too would perish. Miraculously, after what felt like an eternity, I felt the weight above me lessen. Rescue workers had arrived, pulling bodies away to reach survivors. When they finally uncovered me, I was disoriented but conscious. They helped me to my feet and guided me outside, away from the smoldering ruins. The cold night air was a stark contrast to the inferno inside. I stood there, covered in soot, with minor burns on my legs and scalp, injuries that seemed inconsequential compared to the devastation around me. I later learned that 100 people had lost their lives that night, with over 200 more injured. The weight of that knowledge is something I carry with me every day. In the years since, I've grappled with survivors' guilt and recurring nightmares. The memories of that night are a constant presence, but I've found solace in connecting with other survivors and participating in memorial events. Together, we honor those we lost and support each other in healing. While the scars, both physical and emotional, remain, sharing my story has become a way to process the trauma and ensure that such a tragedy is never forgotten. I've had weird dreams before, but nothing like this. It started in a forest. Not just any forest, it felt familiar, even though I couldn't quite place it. The trees were thick, their trunks stretching high into the darkness above. The air was heavy, damp like the way it gets after a storm, but there was no wind, no movement, just an eerie stillness. The strangest part was that it didn't feel like a real forest. It was like someone had built it inside a warehouse, with artificial ground and carefully placed trees. The way theme parks try to recreate nature, but never quite get it right. There was something unsettling about it, but I wasn't alone. My boyfriend was there with me. I don't remember what we were doing at first, just walking, maybe talking, though I couldn't recall any words exchanged. Everything felt slightly off, like a dream where you know something is wrong, but you can't figure out what. The trees suddenly thinned out, and we stepped into an open field. The ground was uneven, with patches of tall grass swaying slightly, though there was no wind. The sky above was a deep, suffocating black, not the kind of night sky filled with stars, just an endless, heavy void pressing down. And then I saw her. She stood just a few meters behind me. A woman in a black trench coat, her presence unnatural in its stillness. Her face was hard to make out, but something about her was deeply unsettling. She wasn't moving, just watching. There was something about the way she stood, like she had been waiting for me. Then, as if it was the most normal thing in the world, she reached out her hand. And it was an orange lighter. The lighter had a white sticker on it, but the writing was smudged, barely legible. I took it without thinking, my fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. Her skin was cold. Then, before I could say anything, I woke up. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. The dream had felt too real, the kind that lingers even after you wake up. I rubbed my hands together, half expecting to feel the lighter between my fingers, but of course there was nothing. It was just a dream. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I told my boyfriend about it later that day, casually bringing it up over text. I wasn't expecting anything to come of it, just a weird dream, something to laugh about. But as soon as I described the lighter, something changed. He got quiet. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. His family had a lighter just like the one in my dream. An orange one, with a white sticker on it that had writing smeared across it. His dad had thrown it out a few days before. I read the message again, my fingers suddenly cold. My first thought was that he was messing with me, but there was no reason for him to. I hadn't even known this lighter existed. I had never seen it, never touched it. So how did I dream about it? And then he asked me about the woman. I described her as best as I could, her black trench coat, the way she stood, how she didn't speak or move. And that's when he told me. I had just described his mom. The realization sent a deep, twisting chill through my body. I had never met his mom. We lived far apart, in different places, different time zones. I had never seen a single picture of her. And yet, I had dreamt of her standing there in that empty field, handing me a lighter I had never known existed. For the first time in my life, I felt something I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear in the way you'd be afraid of a shadow in your room or something moving in the dark. It was a deeper kind of unease, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. I spent the rest of the day trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe I had seen the lighter before, just in passing, and my brain had pulled it from some forgotten memory. Maybe I had overheard something about his mom without realizing it. Maybe it was all a coincidence. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I failed. It didn't make sense. That night, I kept thinking about the dream. The way the field had felt too empty. The way his mom had just stood there, silently watching me. The weight of the lighter in my hand. At some point, I fell asleep. And that's when I saw her again. It wasn't the same dream this time, but she was there. Not in a field, not in a forest, just standing in the corner of my room, barely visible in the dark. I couldn't see her face, but I knew it was her. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then she stepped closer. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs. I shot up in bed, my hands trembling as I turned on the light. The room was empty. No one was there. But for the longest time, I just sat there, staring at the corner where she had been. It was just a dream. I kept telling myself that, over and over again, but the feeling wouldn't leave. The same unease, that same deep, cold fear I had felt the day before. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I decided not to tell my boyfriend about the second dream. I didn't want to talk about it anymore. I didn't want to think about it. But the image of his mom in the trench coat, the lighter in her hand, was burned into my mind. It wasn't something I could forget, no matter how hard I tried. And even now, after all this time, I still don't have an explanation. I never saw the lighter in real life. I never met his mom. But somehow, for reasons I still don't understand, I dreamt of both. And that is something I can never shake. It started in the dark. A world beneath the surface, carved into the stone, where the air hummed with the deep vibration of industry. I was an underground engineer, tasked with keeping the boilers running. Massive steel behemoths, 30 feet high, lined up in their cavernous chambers, coughing out steam and radiating heat. They powered everything, our work, our homes, our lives. If too many failed at once, the town lost power. If the town lost power, the air pumps failed. If the air pumps failed, we died. This wasn't a theory. We'd seen it happen before. The city was a vast, self-contained world. Nobody had been to the surface in generations. Outside, disease and rot had swallowed the land, leaving us as the last remnants of humanity in this place beneath the earth. The tunnels stretched endlessly, leading to factories, schools, dormitories, and markets. The town was alive with thousands of people, each with their place in the careful order of things. I had a place. I had a purpose. I had a family. My wife, Helen, worked at the school. She taught the younger ones how to read, how to write, how to think. Our 3 children were there with her. Robert, the eldest, nearly old enough to start his own work in the mines. Lily, still young enough to hold my hand when we walked through the tunnels. And Samuel, our baby, still learning how to form full sentences. I knew every detail of our life. The way our small house was arranged, metal-framed beds against the walls, a wooden table in the center where we ate together. The smell of oil and coal that clung to my uniform, the sound of Helen's voice as she read stories to the children at night. I could feel the warmth of the boiler rooms, the cold of the stone tunnels, the rough texture of the tools in my hands. I had friends, co-workers. We spent long hours together, cursing at rusted parts, burning our hands on scalding pipes. We drank together after long shifts, sitting on overturned crates in the maintenance corridors, passing around bottles of homemade liquor. I had a whole life. I had spent years living it, day after day, memory upon memory stacking up, unshakable in their reality. And then suddenly, light, bright, blinding, I was lying on my back. The air smelled wrong, too clean, too sterile. My body felt heavy, like I had been crushed beneath something massive. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't obey. Voices, faces I didn't know, people speaking to me, asking me things. Their words were clear, but they didn't make sense. It was as if I had woken up in another world, one that didn't belong to me. My mind scrambled to put it all together. I was in a hospital. My body was weak, my skin clammy with sweat. I had been sick. A bacterial infection, they said. Fever dreams. Hallucinations. For days unconscious. For days. The memories of my underground life were crushing. 30 years. A wife, children, friends, routines, responsibilities. All of it was still in my head, perfectly intact, as real as anything I had ever known. But it wasn't real. Helen had never existed. My children had never existed. The underground city, the boilers, the constant struggle to keep everything running, it was nothing. Just a fabrication of my fevered brain. I tried to process it, but the weight of it was unbearable. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt as if I had lost everything. More than lost, it had been stolen from me. Ripped away in an instant, replaced by this world, this version of reality that I was supposed to accept as the only truth. But how could I? How could I believe this world when the other had felt just as real? I didn't speak about it. Not to the doctors, not to my girlfriend. When she visited me, she was more focused on how close I had come to dying. I understood that. To her, the real concern was the illness, the fact that I had survived. But to me, that was secondary. What mattered was what had happened in my mind. Even after I was released, it didn't fade. I could still picture the underground town with perfect clarity. I could see the streets, the dim sodium lights casting long shadows on the walls. I could hear the low hum of machinery, the rhythmic hissing of steam. I could remember Helen's voice, Robert's laughter, the way Lily would clutch my sleeve when she was nervous. But they weren't real. The grief was unbearable. I had lost a family, a home, a life. But how do you grieve something that never existed? How do you mourn people who were never born? I tried to push it down, to remind myself that none of it was real. But my mind wouldn't let go. My hands still remembered the feel of the tools I had used every day in the boiler room. My ears still strained to hear the familiar sounds of the tunnels. My heart still ached for the children who had never been mine. I became distant, detached. I went through the motions of life, but nothing felt real. The world outside felt flimsy, like a thin layer of paint covering something deeper, something I just couldn't reach anymore. Some nights, I dreamed of them, not as nightmares, but as memories. I would dream of walking through the tunnels, of coming home after a long shift, of Helen greeting me at the door with tired eyes and a warm smile. I would hear Robert asking questions about my work, eager to learn. I would hold Lily's hand as we walked through the streets, watching Samuel toddle ahead of us, laughing. And then I would wake up. Each time, it was like losing them all over again. I tried to move on. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than a fevered dream, that my brain had played a cruel trick on me. But even now, years later, I still remember everything. I remember their voices, their faces, the way our home looked, the work I did, the feeling of exhaustion after a long shift. It wasn't real, but I remember it, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget.